wind cut across the mountain pass like a blade made of ice, and Ren Ashcombe felt her arms shaking as she pulled the rope tighter around her shoulders. Behind her, the wooden coffin scraped against the frozen ground, leaving a long dark line in the snow. She had been walking since sunrise. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Somewhere ahead, beyond the white ridge and the black trees, was the only home she had left, and inside the coffin was the only family she had left. She heard the horns before she saw the army. The sound rolled down from the mountain like thunder trapped in a horn of bone, low and deep, shaking snow loose from the branches above her. Ren froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. She had heard stories about the king's army marching through these passes. Everyone in the valley had heard the stories. Soldiers who moved like shadows, who did not feel the cold, who answered to a king that was not entirely a man. She looked left. She looked right. There was nowhere to hide. The pass was narrow, walled in by rock on one side, and a steep drop on the other, and the coffin behind her was too heavy to lift and run with. So she did the only thing she could do. She stood her ground, one hand resting on the hilt of the silver blade at her hip, and waited. The first line of soldiers appeared over the ridge like a wave of dark armor against white snow. There were hundreds of them, maybe more, moving in perfect silence except for the crunch of boots. Ren's heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had grown up hearing that these were not ordinary soldiers, that somewhere among them walked something else, something with claws instead of hands when the moon was right, and eyes that could see in the dark. She had always thought those stories were exaggerated, village tales meant to frighten children into staying near the fire at night. But standing there, watching hundreds of soldiers freeze in their tracks all at once, as if some invisible hand had reached out and stopped them, she began to wonder if the stories had not gone far enough. The entire army stopped, not gradually, not in a ripple that spread backward through the ranks, the way soldiers usually slowed when their commander raised a hand. It happened all at once, like a held breath. One moment they were marching, and the next, every single soldier stood frozen, heads turning toward her, nostrils flaring, as though they had caught a scent carried on the wind. Ren's hand tightened around the hilt of her blade. Somewhere near the front of that vast, silent army, a man began walking toward her. He did not walk like the others. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a predator walks when it has already decided the hunt is over. He was tall, with dark hair pushed back from a face that looked carved rather than born, and even from a distance, Ren could feel the weight of his presence pressing against her chest like a hand. She had never seen the Alpha King before, but she did not need anyone to tell her who this was. Cale Draven stopped a few paces away from her, close enough that she could see his eyes were the color of amber caught in firelight. He was staring at her, the way a man stares at something he does not believe is real, even though it stands directly in front of him. Behind him, hundreds of soldiers remained frozen, watching, waiting, none of them daring to move without his command. "Step away from her," one of the generals barked from somewhere in the ranks, his voice sharp with alarm. "She carries hunter steel." Ren's fingers curled tighter around her blade. She did not lower it. She had learned a long time ago that lowering your weapon in front of strangers was how people ended up dead, and she had already lost enough. She would not lose her own life to the very creatures that had taken everything from her. But Cale did not step back. He did not even seem to notice the blade at all. His gaze moved past her hand, past the silver edge glinting in the weak winter light, and settled instead on the coffin behind her, half buried in snow, the rope still wrapped around her shoulders. "Who are you carrying?" he asked. His voice was low, quieter than she expected from a king who commanded an army large enough to shake mountains. Ren's throat tightened. She had not spoken to another living person in 3 days, not since she had wrapped her father's body and begun the long walk toward the burial grounds near her childhood home. She had rehearsed 100 answers to 100 questions people might ask her on the road. She had not rehearsed an answer for this one, because she had never imagined the person asking would be him. "My father," she said finally, her voice rough from cold and disuse. "I am taking him home." Something shifted behind Cale's eyes. Ren could not name it, but it looked almost like grief, which did not make sense to her at all. Kings did not grieve for strangers, especially not kings who led armies of soldiers whispered to be something more than human, armies that hunted her kind, the way farmers hunted wolves, that threatened their livestock. Except, she realized with a slow and creeping horror, it was the other way. It had always been the other way. Her family were the hunters. His people were the ones being hunted, at least in the stories the wolves told about themselves. Ren had grown up on stories where men like Kale were monsters. She wondered, standing there with snow falling silently around them both, what stories his people told about her. "Why has your entire army stopped?" she asked, because the silence had grown too large, too strange, and she needed something to fill it before her fear filled it instead. Kale did not answer right away. He studied her face for a long moment, then let his gaze drift down to her hands, to the rope burns across her palms, to the dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of days without real sleep. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something she did not expect. Not command, not threat, something closer to disbelief. "Because of you," he said simply. Ren's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means," Kale said, taking one careful step closer, though he stopped well short of the distance her blade could reach, "that I have not felt anything like this in my entire life, and neither has anyone standing behind me. My soldiers did not stop marching because I ordered them to stop. They stopped because something in the wind told every wolf in this army that we had found something we thought no longer existed." "I don't understand," Ren said, though a cold feeling was beginning to spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. "Neither do I," Kale admitted. "Not fully, but I intend to find out." General Voss, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and a face permanently set into a scowl, pushed his way through the ranks and came to stand beside his king. His eyes flicked between Kale and Ren with open suspicion, lingering longest on the blade still gripped in her hand. "My king," Voss said carefully. "She is a hunter. Her family has killed our kind for generations. Whatever this is, it is not something to be trusted." "I am aware of what she is," Kale said, without looking away from Ren. "Then you understand the danger." "I understand," Kale said, "that an entire army does not stop marching for nothing, Voss. Not even for me." Ren watched the exchange with growing unease. She did not know what they were talking about, not exactly, but she understood enough to know that something had happened the moment she stepped into view, something that neither man fully controlled. She thought of her father, of the years he had spent teaching her to fight, to run, to survive in a world that had never been kind to people like them. She thought of the guild that had killed him, hunters who valued sport over survival, who had turned on their own for refusing to join their cruelty. She thought of how alone she was now, dragging his body through the snow with no one left to help her. And she thought, with a bitterness that surprised even her, that perhaps the wolves were not the only monsters in this story. "I am not here to cause trouble," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even though her legs had begun to tremble from cold and exhaustion both. "I only want to bury my father and be left alone. I have no interest in your war, or your army, or whatever strange thing just happened between us. Let me pass, and you will never see me again." For a moment, she thought he might agree. His expression flickered with something that looked almost like reluctance, as though a part of him wanted to grant her exactly what she asked. But then his eyes moved to the darkening sky above them, to the storm clouds gathering heavy and gray over the peaks, and something in his posture changed. "The pass ahead floods with snow within the hour," he said. "You will not survive the night alone out here, not with a burden like that to carry." "I have survived worse." "Perhaps," Kale said, "but you will not survive this." Ren opened her mouth to argue, but the wind chose that moment to howl through the pass, with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet, and she understood, with a sinking feeling, that he was right. The temperature had dropped sharply in the time they had been standing there, and the sky had grown darker than it should have been so early in the day. She had felt the storm coming for the last hour, had been trying to outrun it, and had failed. "I do not need your help," she said, even as her teeth began to chatter. "I am not offering it as a kindness," Kale said, and for the first time, something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I am offering it because my soldiers will not move another step until I decide what to do about you. And I refuse to let an entire army freeze to death in this pass, because you are too stubborn to accept shelter." Behind him, Voss made a low sound of disapproval, but he said nothing further. The other soldiers remained silent, watching the exchange with expressions Ren could not read, somewhere between curiosity and wariness. She realized, looking at their faces, that they were as unsettled by all of this as she was. Whatever had happened when she stepped into the pass, it had shaken something loose in every single one of them, and none of them seemed to know quite what to do with that. "If I say yes," Ren said slowly, "what happens to the coffin?" "It comes with us," Kale said. "You will not leave your father in the snow, and I will not ask you to." That, more than anything else, was what finally broke through her defenses. She had expected threats. She had expected demands, or worse, an order disguised as a request. She had not expected a king with an army of hundreds to speak about her father's body with something close to respect. "Fine," she said, the word tasting strange in her mouth. "But I am not letting go of this rope." "I would not expect you to," Kale said. He turned then, calling out orders in a language Ren did not fully recognize, though she caught the rhythm of command in it, the way soldiers straightened at the sound of his voice. Within minutes, the army began to move again, not marching onward toward whatever war awaited them, but turning instead toward a wide clearing just off the pass, where tents began rising against the wind with practiced speed. Ren stood in the middle of it all, still gripping the rope tied to her father's coffin, watching hundreds of soldiers who should have been her enemies build a camp around her as the storm finally broke overhead. Snow began falling in thick, heavy sheets, and somewhere in the chaos of it, she felt Kale's eyes still on her, steady and unreadable, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She did not know what strange pull had stopped an entire army in its tracks, or what it meant that a king who was rumored to be more wolf than man had looked at her and seen something worth stopping for. All she knew was that the wind had turned bitter and the snow had turned to ice, and for tonight, at least, she was no longer walking alone. That thought frightened her more than the storm did. A young soldier approached with a heavy fur cloak draped over his arm, his eyes darting nervously toward Ren, before he held it out toward her without a word. She hesitated, studying his face for any sign of trickery, but found only awkward kindness there, the kind of expression a person wears when they have been given an order they do not fully understand, but intend to follow anyway. She took the cloak. Her hands were shaking too hard to refuse it any longer. "Thank you," she said quietly, and the young soldier looked so startled by the words that he nearly dropped the second bundle of supplies he carried. "You are welcome," he managed, then hurried away, as though her gratitude had frightened him more than her blade ever could. Ren wrapped the cloak around her shoulders, over the rope still cutting into her skin, and felt warmth begin to seep back into her bones for the first time in hours. She watched the camp rise around her with a strange, detached fascination. Tents unfolded in rows with mechanical precision. Fires sprang to life in pits dug quickly and efficiently into the snow. Somewhere nearby, she heard the low murmur of soldiers speaking to one another, their voices carrying threads of a language that shifted between common speech and something older, something with a rhythm like a heartbeat. She had always imagined the wolves as something feral, something that lived only for violence and hunger. But watching them now, she saw soldiers checking on each other's wounds, sharing bread pulled from travel packs, laughing quietly at some joke she could not hear. It unsettled her more than any show of aggression could have. It was much harder to hate something that looked, in this moment, almost human. Kale found her standing near the edge of the clearing some time later, still holding the rope, still refusing to sit, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing down her shoulders. He did not say anything at first. He simply crouched beside the coffin, resting one hand against the wood, and looked up at her, with an expression she could not quite place. "You have been walking for 3 days," he said. It was not a question. "How do you know that?" "Your boots are worn through at the heel. Your lips are cracked from wind. You have been walking directly into, and you have not eaten anything in at least a day, maybe longer, because your hands shake even when they are still." He paused. "I have led soldiers on long marches. I know what exhaustion looks like." Ren said nothing. She did not like how easily he had read her, as though her body were an open book he had simply glanced at and understood completely. "Sit," Kale said, gesturing toward a felled log near the nearest fire. "Eat something. Your father will still be here when you are finished." The mention of her father sent a fresh wave of grief crashing through her chest, sharp and sudden, the way it always did when she least expected it. She had spent 3 days focused entirely on the physical task of walking, of dragging the coffin forward one step at a time, because if she stopped moving, she would have to feel the full weight of what she had lost. She was not ready to feel that weight. Not here. Not in front of an army of strangers who were supposed to be her enemies. But her legs betrayed her, folding beneath her without permission, and she found herself sitting on the log before she had consciously decided to move at all. Cale settled nearby, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel the strange warmth radiating from him despite the falling snow. A soldier brought a bowl of something warm and set it in her hands without a word. Ren stared down at it for a long moment before finally lifting the spoon, and the first taste of hot broth against her tongue nearly undid her entirely. She had forgotten what warmth felt like. She had forgotten, somewhere in the last 3 days, what it felt like to be cared for, in even the smallest way. "Tell me about him," Cale said quietly. "Your father." "Why do you want to know?" "Because you have carried him through a mountain pass in the middle of winter, rather than leave him behind, and I think that says more about the kind of man he was than anything I could learn from watching you fight." Ren's fingers tightened around the bowl. She had not spoken about her father since the night he died, had not allowed herself the space to remember him as anything other than a body she needed to carry home. But something about the quiet of the camp, the crackle of the fire, the strange gentleness in Cale's voice, loosened something in her chest that she had been holding shut for days. "He taught me to survive," she said finally. "Not to fight for sport, the way some hunters do. He always said that killing for pleasure made you no better than the things you claimed to hunt. He believed we were meant to protect people, not terrorize them." Her voice cracked. The guild did not agree with him. They wanted hunters who would kill anything that moved, for coin, for glory, for nothing at all. When he refused to join them, they called it treason. "And they killed him for it," Cale said quietly. Ren nodded, unable to trust her voice any further. The fire popped and hissed beside them, throwing shifting light across the snow, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. She had expected him to press further, to ask for details she was not ready to give, but he simply sat beside her in silence, letting the grief settle into the space between them, without trying to fill it with empty words. "I am sorry," he said eventually, "for your loss. You did not know him." "No," Cale agreed, "but I know what it costs to lose someone you love to violence that should never have happened. That kind of grief does not require familiarity to understand." Something in his voice told her he was not speaking in generalities. There was a weight behind his words, a history she could not see but could sense pressing against them like a shadow. She found herself wondering, despite every instinct telling her not to care, what losses a king like him might carry. She did not ask, not yet. The night had grown too fragile for more questions, and she was too tired to hold up under the weight of any more answers. Instead, she finished the broth in silence, watching the fire burn low, watching the snow fall steadily beyond the ring of light, watching the strange and impossible king, who sat beside her, as though her presence had rearranged something fundamental inside his chest. When exhaustion finally pulled her under, she did not remember falling asleep. She only remembered, faintly, the sensation of a cloak being tucked more securely around her shoulders, and a voice, low and rough, murmuring words she was too far gone to understand. She woke only once during the night, briefly, to the sound of low voices arguing somewhere near the edge of the camp. She recognized Voss's harsh tone immediately, sharp with frustration, though she could not make out the words. Cale's voice answered, calm and final, the voice of a man who had already made a decision, and did not intend to be argued out of it. Ren drifted back to sleep before she could piece together what they were fighting about. But some instinct, buried deep beneath her exhaustion, told her that whatever it was, it had everything to do with her. And somewhere in the dark, though she was too asleep to notice, Cale remained awake long after the argument ended, watching over the fire, watching over her, as though some invisible thread now bound his fate to a stranger he had known for less than a single day. Ren woke to the sound of raised voices and the sharp scent of smoke curling through cold morning air. She sat up fast, heart hammering, one hand already reaching for the blade she had kept beneath the cloak all night. For a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the pass, the coffin, the impossible king who had offered her shelter. Then the memory of the previous night crashed back over her all at once, and she scrambled to her feet, just as General Voss stormed past the fire, his face dark with anger. "This is madness," Voss was saying, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "You cannot delay the march for a hunter's daughter, no matter what your instincts tell you. We are due at the eastern border in 4 days. The enemy will not wait for you to solve a mystery." "The army moves when I say it moves," Kale answered, his tone even, though Ren could hear the strain beneath it. "I am not asking anyone to abandon the march. I am asking for 1 additional day. That is all. 1 day becomes 2. 2 becomes a week. I have seen this before, my king, though perhaps you do not remember it as clearly as I do." Something in the way Voss said those last words made Kale go very still. Ren, watching from a distance, felt the tension between the 2 men sharpen into something almost dangerous, though neither of them raised a hand toward the other. Whatever history existed between them, it was old, and it was heavy, and it clearly had nothing to do with her directly, even as her presence seemed to be the spark that had reignited it. "I remember it perfectly," Kale said quietly, "which is exactly why I am being careful this time." Voss's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further. He turned instead and stalked toward the far end of the camp, where several soldiers quickly found reasons to look busy rather than meet his eyes. Kale remained standing where he was for a long moment, his shoulders tense, before he seemed to notice Ren, watching him from across the fire. "Good morning," he said, and the sudden shift in his voice, from cold command to something almost gentle, startled her. "What was that about?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. "Nothing that concerns you." It sounded like it concerned me a great deal. Kale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that Ren felt a strange flutter in her chest she did not want to examine too closely. "You are observant," he said. "That will serve you well, wherever you end up." "I intend to end up at my father's burial ground," she said firmly, "and nowhere else." Of course. But something in the way he said it made her uneasy, as though he knew something about her future that she did not know herself. She pushed the thought aside, too tired and too grief-stricken to chase down every strange feeling that crossed her path since stepping into this pass. Instead, she focused on the practical matter of the day ahead. The burial ground was still a full day's walk from where they stood, deeper into the mountains, in a small valley where her family had buried their dead for 3 generations. "I need to keep moving," she said. "The longer I wait, the harder the ground will freeze, and I do not have the strength to dig through solid ice." Kale studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "Then we will move with you. I did not ask for an army to escort me." "You did not ask," he agreed, "but I am offering regardless. The storm from last night has made the eastern pass unstable. Snowdrifts have buried sections of the trail, and there are places where the ground beneath the snow can no longer be trusted to hold a person's weight. My scouts know this terrain. Without them, you risk losing more than time." Ren wanted to argue. Every instinct she had spent years honing told her to refuse, to insist on her independence, to remind herself and everyone around her that she needed no one. But she thought of the coffin, of the long day ahead, of the very real danger of hidden crevices beneath fresh snow, and she swallowed her pride instead. "Fine," she said, "but I am walking beside the coffin, not behind your soldiers, and not surrounded like some prisoner." Agreed. The army broke camp within the hour, moving with the same eerie efficiency Ren had witnessed the night before. Tents folded down into compact bundles, fires were extinguished and buried beneath snow. Within a short time, there was almost no trace that hundreds of soldiers had spent the night in that clearing at all, save for the churned earth beneath the snow and the lingering scent of wood smoke. Ren walked at the front of the procession, the rope once again tied around her shoulders, though this time several soldiers had rigged a sled beneath the coffin to ease the burden of dragging it across uneven ground. She had protested the help at first, but exhaustion and practicality had won out over pride, and she found herself grudgingly grateful for the easier pace it allowed. Kale walked beside her for most of the morning, matching her stride without seeming to try, his presence a steady and unsettling constant at her side. They did not speak much at first. Ren was not in the habit of casual conversation, especially not with a man whose very existence upended everything she had been taught to believe about his kind. But as the hours passed and the silence stretched between them, she found herself curious despite herself. "Why did your army stop for me?" she finally asked, the question that had been gnawing at her since the previous day finally breaking free. You said it was not something you controlled. What did you mean? Kale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, though Ren got the sense he was choosing his words carefully, rather than avoiding the question entirely. Among my kind, he said slowly, there exists a bond between certain pairs of people. It is rare, rarer than rare in fact. Most wolves live their entire lives without ever encountering it. The old stories call it the mate bond, though the word does not fully capture what it means. It is not simply attraction, or affection, or even love in the way most people understand it. It is recognition. A part of you knows, instantly and completely, that you have found the other half of something you did not know was incomplete. Ren's steps faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered her pace. And you believe this bond exists between us? I believe, Kale said carefully, that something happened in that pass yesterday that I have never experienced before. Not once in all my years leading this army. My soldiers felt it too. That is not something easily explained away. That's absurd, Ren said, though her voice lacked the conviction she wanted it to carry. We are strangers. I know nothing about you, and you know nothing about me. Bonds like that do not simply appear out of thin air. I did not say I understood it, Kale replied. Only that I could not deny it. Ren fell silent, turning the words over in her mind as they continued walking. She wanted to dismiss it entirely, to file it away alongside every other strange story she had heard about wolves and their supposed magic, but some small, traitorous part of her remembered the way her chest had tightened the moment she first saw him, the way something in her had recognized him before her mind had time to catch up. She had told herself it was fear. Now she was no longer certain. Even if it were true, she said finally, it would not change anything. I am a hunter's daughter. You are the Alpha King. Our kinds have been enemies for longer than either of us has been alive. Whatever this bond claims to be, it does not erase generations of blood between our people. No, Kale agreed, it does not. But it also does not disappear simply because we wish it would. They walked on in silence after that, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. Ren found herself stealing glances at him throughout the day, studying the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes whenever he scanned the trail ahead for danger, the way his soldiers seemed to relax slightly whenever he walked near them, as though his presence alone offered some measure of comfort. She hated how easily she noticed these things. She hated even more how much she wanted to keep noticing them. By midday, the trail narrowed into a steep incline that forced the procession to slow considerably. Ren's arms burned with the effort of steadying the sled against the uneven ground, and more than once, Kale reached out to help without being asked, his hands brushing against hers in ways that sent unwelcome warmth racing up her arm each time. It was during one of these moments, as they paused to catch their breath near a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below, that Ren finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building in her chest since the previous night. Who did you lose? She asked quietly. Last night, you said you understood what it costs to lose someone to violence that should not have happened. I want to know who you meant. Kale's expression shifted, the easy calm he usually carried slipping just slightly, to reveal something rawer underneath. For a moment, she thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat back into the careful distance he had maintained since they met. But then he let out a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. My sister, he said. Her name was Ellen. She died many years ago, during a border conflict with a hunter guild that believed peace between our kinds was a weakness rather than a strength. She was not a soldier. She had no part in the fighting at all. She simply happened to be in the wrong place when violence found her anyway. Ren felt the air leave her lungs. I am sorry, she said, and meant it completely. It was a long time ago, Kale said, though the tightness in his voice suggested the wound had never fully closed. But it taught me something I have carried ever since. Hatred does not discriminate between the guilty and the innocent. It simply consumes whatever stands closest to it. I have spent years trying to build something different among my people, a kingdom that does not require endless war to justify its existence. And yet you lead an army toward battle even now, Ren said, though there was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity. Not every battle is one we choose, Kale said. Some are forced upon us by those who refuse to accept peace as an option. I would end this war tomorrow if I believed it possible. I do not have that luxury. Ren studied him for a long moment, seeing him now not simply as the terrifying king from village legends, nor as the strange and unsettling stranger who had stopped his army for her, but as someone shaped by the same kind of loss that had shaped her own life. A person who had lost someone he loved to senseless violence, who had spent years trying to build something better from the wreckage of that grief. It was a familiar shape, one she recognized in the mirror every single day. My father wanted the same thing, she said quietly. Peace, not because he was weak, or because he did not know how to fight. He wanted it because he understood what fighting costs, better than anyone who had never truly lost something to it. He sounds like a wise man. He was, Ren said, and for the first time since his death, the words did not feel like a wound reopening. They felt, instead, like something closer to comfort. For a while after that, neither of them spoke, but the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt, strangely, like something shared rather than something to endure. Ren found her mind drifting back to memories she had not allowed herself to visit in days, small moments with her father that had nothing to do with his death, and everything to do with the life they had built together, before violence tore it apart. She remembered him teaching her to track deer through fresh snow when she was barely old enough to hold a bow steady, his patient voice correcting her stance without a hint of frustration, even when she failed a dozen times before succeeding once. She remembered him laughing at her attempts to cook over an open flame during their first hunting trip together, the way he had eaten her burnt, half-raw meal anyway without a single complaint, simply because she had made it herself. She had not realized how much she needed to remember him this way, as a father, rather than as a body she had carried through the snow, until the memories rose unbidden and settled warm in her chest, despite the cold air around her. "You are smiling," Kale observed quietly, glancing at her sideways. Ren startled, unaware her expression had shifted at all. "I was thinking about him," she admitted. "Something good, for once." "That is not a small thing," Kale said. "Grief has a way of drowning out the good memories first. It takes real effort to pull them back to the surface." "You sound like you have experience with that." "More than I would like," he said, a faint, rueful edge to his voice. "For years after Ellen died, I could only remember the last moment I saw her. It took a long time before I could remember her laughing again instead." Ren looked at him then, really looked, past the crown he did not wear but somehow still carried in his posture, past the army marching quietly around them, past every story she had ever been told about wolves and kings and the monsters they were supposed to be. She saw, instead, a man who understood loss the same way she did, who carried it the same careful way, refusing to let it calcify into something that consumed him entirely. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me about her." Kale did not answer right away, but something in his expression softened further, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller than it had any right to feel after only a single day. They resumed walking soon after, the trail winding further into the mountains, as afternoon light began to soften toward evening. Ren found herself walking a little closer to Kale than she had before, though she told herself it was only for warmth, only for practicality against the biting wind. She did not examine the lie too closely. As the sun began sinking toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and violet, one of the scouts came racing back down the trail toward them, his face pale with alarm. "My king," he said, breathless, "there is something ahead on the trail. Tracks, fresh ones, leading toward the ridge above the valley. They do not belong to any of our scouts." Kale's expression hardened instantly, the warmth that had settled over his features throughout the day, vanishing beneath something sharper, more alert. Ren felt the shift in him immediately, the way his entire body seemed to coil with readiness, and beside her, she noticed several soldiers reaching quietly for their weapons. "How many tracks?" Kale asked. "At least a dozen, my king, moving parallel to our position, staying just out of sight along the ridge." Ren's stomach tightened with dread. She thought immediately of the hunter guild that had killed her father, of the enemies he had made in his final months, of the possibility that whoever had murdered him might have followed her trail through the mountains, waiting for the right moment to finish what they had started. Kale turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same suspicion already forming. "Do you know who this might be?" he asked quietly. Ren's hand tightened around the rope still tied to the coffin. and for the first time since stepping into that mountain pass, real fear settled cold and heavy in her chest. "I think I might," she said. "And if I am right, they are not here for you." Cale raised a fist, and the entire column behind him stopped as one, soldiers fanning out along the trail with a silence that made Ren's skin crawl. She had seen trained fighters move before, had trained alongside her father for years, but nothing had prepared her for the eerie coordination of an army that seemed to share a single mind. "Tell me everything," Cale said, turning back to her, his voice low and urgent. "Who would be tracking you through these mountains?" Ren's throat felt tight. "The guild that killed my father. They call themselves the Ashford Order. My father refused to hunt for sport, refused to take contracts that had nothing to do with survival, and they saw that as a betrayal of everything they stood for. When he spoke out against them publicly, when he tried to convince other hunters to leave, they made an example of him. And you believe they might come after you as well?" "I know they would," Ren said. "I was there when they threatened him, the week before he died. They told him his defiance would not end with just him. I thought I had outrun them these past 3 days. I was wrong." Cale's jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes that looked distinctly like anger, though it was carefully controlled, banked down beneath the calm exterior of a man used to commanding himself as much as he commanded others. "How many were in this guild?" "I do not know exactly. Enough that my father always spoke of them as though they were a small army, rather than a hunting party. 20, perhaps 30 at full strength." "And the tracks my scout found?" "A dozen," Ren said, remembering the scout's report. "That would be a scouting party, sent ahead to confirm my location before the rest follow." Cale turned to the scout who had brought the warning, issuing a series of quiet commands that sent soldiers moving into positions along the ridge above and the trail below, forming a loose but deliberate perimeter around the procession. Ren watched with a strange mixture of relief and unease as the army that had once seemed so alien to her transformed seamlessly into a wall of protection around her and her father's coffin. "You do not need to do this," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. "This is not your fight." "You made it my fight the moment my army stopped for you," Cale said, not unkindly. "Besides, I have no intention of allowing a hunter guild to finish what they started on people who no longer have the strength to defend themselves." Ren wanted to argue further, wanted to insist that she could handle this alone, the way she had told herself for 3 days that she needed no one, but she thought of the coffin behind her, of how vulnerable she truly was out here without allies, and she found she could not summon the same stubborn independence that had carried her this far. "What do we do now?" she asked instead. "We wait," Cale said, "and we let them come to us, rather than walking blindly into whatever position they have chosen." The waiting proved to be its own kind of torment. Ren stood near the coffin, her hand resting on the rope out of habit more than necessity, watching the tree line along the ridge for any sign of movement. The soldiers around her had gone unnervingly still, their attention fixed outward, their bodies coiled with a readiness that made the hair on her arms stand up despite the cold. Cale remained close beside her, near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, even through the layers of her cloak. She found herself grateful for his presence, in a way she did not have the energy to examine too closely, not with danger pressing in from the trees around them. "They will not attack an army this size directly," Cale said quietly, as though reading the fear building in her chest. "A scouting party of a dozen against hundreds of soldiers would be suicide. Whatever they intend, it will not be a direct confrontation." "Then what are they planning?" "They are likely trying to determine whether you are alone, or whether you have found protection. If they report back that you now travel with an army, their strategy will change entirely." "To what?" Cale's expression darkened slightly. "To something more patient. More dangerous, in the long run, even if it is less immediate." Ren's stomach twisted at the implication. She had spent 3 days believing that survival meant simply reaching her father's burial ground, that once she laid him to rest, the worst of her ordeal would be behind her. Now she was beginning to understand that the danger she faced extended far beyond a single journey through the mountains. Movement flickered at the tree line, and every soldier around them tensed in unison. Ren's hand flew to her blade, though Cale's arm came up gently in front of her, not restraining exactly, but signaling caution. "Wait," he murmured. A figure emerged from the trees, hands raised in a gesture of peace, though Ren recognized the calculated nature of the movement immediately. She had seen enough hunters in her lifetime to know when someone was performing surrender, rather than offering it genuinely. The man who stepped forward was lean and weathered, with cold eyes that swept over the assembled soldiers with open calculation rather than fear. Cassian, Ren breathed, recognition washing over her in a wave of nausea. She knew this man. He had trained alongside her father for years, before joining the Ashford Order, had once eaten dinner at their table more times than she could count. Seeing him now, standing at the edge of an ambush clearly meant for her, felt like a betrayal sharpened to a fine point. "Ren," Cassian said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, deceptively warm despite the circumstances. "You have made powerful friends, it seems, though I doubt the Order will be pleased to learn you have thrown in your lot with wolves." "I have thrown in with no one," Ren called back, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the tremor she felt building beneath her ribs. "I am simply burying my father, something your Order made necessary." Something flickered across Cassian's face, too quick to name, before his expression smoothed back into careful neutrality. "Your father made his own choices, Ren, choices that endangered everyone who stood beside him. We did not want this outcome any more than you did. You murdered him." "We executed a traitor," Cassian corrected, though his voice lacked the conviction the words demanded. "The Order does not tolerate weakness, and your father's insistence on mercy toward the wolves put every hunter in this region at risk. Surely you understand that, even now." Ren felt heat rising in her chest, grief and fury tangling together into something dangerous. Beside her, she felt Cale go very still, his attention sharpening on Cassian with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. "You are trespassing on protected ground," Cale said, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmur of soldiers around them instantly. "This girl travels under my protection. Whatever quarrel your Order believes it has with her family, it ends here." Cassian's eyes flicked toward Cale for the first time, calculation replacing the false warmth he had shown Ren only moments before. "The Alpha King himself," he said, something almost mocking in his tone. "I did not realize hunters had fallen so far in your esteem that you would personally escort one through the mountains." "I would escort any innocent person threatened by violence they did not invite," Cale said, "regardless of what blood runs through their veins." "How noble," Cassian said, though the word came out edged with contempt. "Tell me, King, does your generosity extend to knowing what her father truly planned before we stopped him? He intended to share hunter secrets with your kind. Techniques passed down through generations, meant only for those sworn to protect the balance between our peoples. He would have handed your enemies every advantage we hold." "That is a lie," Ren snapped, fury overtaking fear entirely now. "My father wanted peace, not betrayal. He wanted hunters and wolves to stop killing each other, over grudges neither side even remembers the origin of anymore." "Peace," Cassian repeated, as though the word tasted foul in his mouth. "There is no peace to be found with creatures that shift into monsters beneath a full moon, Ren. Your father forgot that. It cost him everything. It cost him his life because your Order could not tolerate a man brave enough to question you," Ren shot back. "That is the only truth that matters here." Cassian's expression hardened, the mask of civility finally slipping away entirely. "We came only to confirm your location," he said. "The Order will decide what to do with that information. But know this, Ren Ashcombe. Hiding behind an army of wolves will not protect you forever. Eventually, you will stand alone again, and when that day comes, we will be waiting. Then you will find her waiting alongside allies, who do not abandon their own," Cale said, stepping forward slightly, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous that sent a visible ripple of unease through the dozen hunters still watching from the tree line. "Deliver that message to your Order along with your report. The next time any of you approach this girl with intent to harm her, you will not walk away to deliver a second warning." For a moment, Cassian's composure wavered, and Ren saw something close to genuine fear flicker behind his eyes before he mastered it once more. He gave a short, mocking bow, more insult than respect, before turning and melting back into the tree line, with the rest of his scouting party following close behind. The clearing remained tense long after they disappeared, soldiers holding their positions until Cale finally gave the signal to stand down. Ren found her legs shaking, as the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to drain away, leaving exhaustion and fear in its place. "Are you all right?" Kale asked quietly, turning to face her fully now that the immediate threat had passed. "They will come back," Ren said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "You heard him. This will not end simply because you frightened off a scouting party." "I know," Kale said, "which is why I have no intention of leaving you unprotected once we reach your father's burial ground." "You cannot delay your army indefinitely for my sake," Ren said, though the protest felt weaker than it had the day before. "You have a war to fight, responsibilities that have nothing to do with me." "I have already sent word ahead," Kale said. "My generals can manage the eastern border for several more days without my direct presence. This matters more." "Why?" Ren asked, the question breaking free before she could stop it. "Why does this matter so much to you? I am a stranger, a hunter's daughter no less, from a family your kind has every reason to distrust." "You barely know me." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache, in ways she did not fully understand. "I told you already," he said finally. "The bond does not require time to take root. It simply is, the moment two people find each other. I cannot explain why it chose you and me, out of everyone in this world. I only know that I cannot walk away and leave you to face that guild alone, not when every instinct I have tells me your safety matters more than anything else standing before me." Ren's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, the fear and grief and exhaustion of the past 3 days all fell away, replaced by something warmer, something she did not have a name for yet, but recognized instinctively, as dangerous, in an entirely different way than the hunters who had just retreated into the trees. "This is complicated," she said quietly. "Yes," Kale agreed, "it is. I still need to bury my father." "Then let us continue," he said, offering her a small, steady smile that did more to calm her racing heart than any words could have. "The ground grows harder to dig with each hour we delay." They resumed their journey as the afternoon light continued to fade, the army moving with renewed vigilance now, soldiers positioned more tightly around the procession than before. Ren walked beside Kale in silence for a long while, her mind turning over everything Cassian had said, searching for the lies buried among whatever grains of truth he might have offered. She did not believe her father had ever intended to betray Hunter's secrets. She had known him too well, had watched him agonize over every decision that touched on loyalty and honor, but she also knew that the Ashford Order had never needed real evidence to justify their cruelty. They had needed only an excuse, and her father's refusal to embrace their violence had given them exactly that. As the sun sank fully behind the western peaks, and the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Ren found herself walking closer to Kale than strict necessity required, drawing whatever comfort she could from his presence, as the weight of everything that had happened settled heavily over her exhausted shoulders. Tomorrow, she would finally reach her father's burial ground. Tomorrow, she would say goodbye to the last piece of her old life. The trail grew treacherous as darkness deepened around them, forcing the procession to slow to a careful crawl. Kale called a halt near a narrow gorge where a frozen stream cut through the rock, its surface glazed with ice, thick enough to walk on, though the scouts warned it would not hold the weight of the sled carrying the coffin. Soldiers worked quickly to construct a makeshift bridge from felled timber, lashing the logs together with rope, while others stood guard along the ridges above, watching for any further sign of the Ashford Order. Ren stood near the edge of the gorge, staring down into the darkness below where the frozen stream disappeared into shadow, and felt a wave of dizziness pass through her that had nothing to do with the height. She had not slept properly in days. She had not eaten enough. She had carried grief and fear in equal measure across miles of frozen ground, and now, standing on the edge of a gorge with an enemy somewhere in the trees around her, she felt the full weight of it finally threatening to buckle her knees. "You should rest before we cross," Kale said, appearing at her side with the quiet ease that had become familiar to her over the course of the day. "The bridge will hold, but the crossing requires steady footing, and you are exhausted enough that I worry for your balance." "I am fine," Ren said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "You are not," Kale said gently, "and there is no shame in admitting it. You have carried more in the past 3 days than most people carry in a lifetime." Ren opened her mouth to argue, but exhaustion won out over pride, and instead she simply nodded, allowing herself to sink down onto a nearby rock while the soldiers finished constructing the bridge. Cale sat beside her without being asked, close enough that his warmth pressed against her side, and for a while, neither of them spoke. "Tell me something good," Cale said eventually, breaking the silence. "Something that has nothing to do with grief, or guilds, or war. I think we could both use a moment away from all of it." Ren considered the request for a long moment, surprised by how much she wanted to grant it. "When I was young," she said slowly, "before everything with the Order began, my father used to take me to a lake near our home every summer. We would fish there for hours, though neither of us was particularly skilled at it. I remember one summer we caught nothing at all, an entire week of trying, and instead of being frustrated, he laughed about it until he could barely breathe. He said the fish had simply outsmarted us, and that we should be proud to have been defeated by something so clever." Cale's laugh was quiet but genuine, a sound Ren had not yet heard from him, and it sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her chest. "He sounds like he found joy in unlikely places." "He did," Ren said, smiling faintly at the memory. "He always said that people who could not laugh at their own failures were doomed to be miserable their entire lives. I did not understand what he meant until much later." "That is wisdom worth holding on to," Cale said. "I find myself wishing I could have met him." "He would have liked you," Ren said, then paused, startled by how easily the words had come, and how much she meant them. "Despite everything he taught me about wolves. I think he would have seen past all of that, the way you seemed determined to see past everything you were taught about hunters." Something shifted in Cale's expression, softer and more open than she had seen from him yet, and for a moment, the space between them felt charged with something neither grief nor fear could explain. The soldiers finished the bridge shortly after, and the procession began the careful crossing over the gorge, torches casting flickering light across the ice below. Ren walked close behind the coffin, guiding it carefully over the timber planks, while Cale remained near her side, one hand hovering close enough to catch her should she stumble. Halfway across, disaster nearly struck. One of the ropes securing the makeshift bridge snapped suddenly under the strain, and the timber beneath Ren's feet lurched sideways with a groan of splintering wood. She felt her balance give way entirely, a scream catching in her throat as the dark gorge yawned open beneath her. Cale moved faster than she could track, one arm catching her firmly around the waist and hauling her back against solid footing before she could fall, while soldiers scrambled to secure the loosened rope and stabilize the remaining planks. Ren's heart pounded so violently she could hear nothing but the rush of blood in her own ears, her hands clutching desperately at Cale's arms as the world slowly steadied around her. "I have you," Cale murmured, his voice low and urgent against her ear, his arms tightening protectively around her. "You are safe." For a long moment, neither of them moved, the danger of the near fall giving way to something else entirely, as Ren became acutely aware of how close they stood, of the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palms, of the way his breath had gone unsteady in a manner that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked up at him, and found his eyes already fixed on her, dark with an intensity that made her breath catch all over again. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will always catch you," Cale said quietly, and the words carried a weight far heavier than the simple statement suggested, a promise neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt settled deep into their bones regardless. The soldiers finished repairing the bridge, and the crossing resumed with far greater caution than before. By the time the entire procession reached solid ground on the other side of the gorge, exhaustion had fully overtaken Ren's body, and she barely registered the soldiers setting up camp around her before sleep claimed her entirely, curled beneath a borrowed cloak near the fire, with Cale keeping careful watch beside her long into the night. She had no way of knowing yet that tomorrow would also mark the beginning of everything that came after. The burial ground came into view just after dawn, and Ren's breath caught the moment she saw it, grief and relief crashing into her chest at the same time with such force that she nearly stumbled. 3 generations of her family rested here, beneath simple stone markers arranged in careful rows along a gentle slope overlooking the valley below. She had not been back since her grandmother's burial years ago, but the place had not changed at all, still quiet and still sacred, exactly as she remembered it. "We are close," she said, her voice tight with emotion she no longer had the strength to hide. Cale walked beside her in silence, giving her the space she needed to absorb the moment, though she could feel his attention on her, steady and present, ready to catch her if the weight of it all finally became too much. The army had slowed its pace as they approached, soldiers spreading out respectfully at the edge of the burial ground rather than intruding directly upon it, and Ren found herself grateful for the quiet dignity of the gesture. She led the sled carrying her father's coffin toward a patch of open ground near her mother's grave, a marker worn smooth by years of wind and snow, and stopped there, staring down at the frozen earth with a lump rising in her throat that she could no longer swallow. "This is where he wanted to rest," she said quietly. Beside her, Cale stepped forward without a word and knelt beside the ground, testing the soil with his hands before glancing back at her. "The earth is frozen solid," he said. "This will take considerable effort to dig through properly." "I know," Ren said. "I have a shovel in my pack. I plan to do this alone." "You do not have to," Cale said simply, and before she could argue, he had already begun clearing away the frost covering the surface, his movements steady and purposeful. Ren hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside him, pulling the shovel free from her pack and beginning to break through the frozen ground herself. Several soldiers moved forward as well, offering additional tools without being asked, and soon the quiet burial ground filled with the steady rhythm of digging, dozens of hands working together to carve a resting place from earth that had seemed impossibly hard only minutes before. The work took hours, the frozen ground yielding slowly and grudgingly to their combined effort, but Ren found a strange kind of peace settling over her as the grave deepened, as though the physical labor allowed her grief somewhere useful to go, rather than sitting trapped and festering inside her chest. Cale worked beside her the entire time, never once complaining despite the difficulty, occasionally glancing over to check on her without breaking the rhythm of his own digging. When the grave was finally ready, the soldiers stepped back respectfully, allowing Ren and Cale to lower the coffin into the earth together, the weight of it settling finally into the ground that would hold her father for the rest of time. Ren stood at the edge of the grave for a long moment afterward, staring down at the plain wooden coffin, feeling the full and unbearable weight of finality pressing down on her chest. "I do not know what to say," she admitted quietly, her voice breaking. "I have imagined this moment for 3 days, and now that it is here, I cannot find the words." "You do not need grand words," Cale said gently, standing close beside her. "Only true ones." Ren closed her eyes, drawing a shaking breath before speaking, her voice soft but steady, despite the tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "You taught me everything I know about surviving in this world," she said, addressing the grave directly. "But more than that, you taught me how to survive it without losing myself in the process. You never let hatred turn you into someone you were not, even when the world gave you every reason to become exactly that. I promise I will try to live the same way. I promise I will not let what happened to you turn me into someone you would not recognize." She fell silent after that, unable to continue, and Cale placed a steady hand on her shoulder, not pulling her close, simply offering his presence as an anchor, while grief moved through her in waves. The soldiers around them stood in respectful silence, heads bowed, and Ren found herself deeply moved by the quiet dignity these strangers, these supposed enemies, offered to a hunter they had never even known. When the worst of the grief finally passed, leaving her hollow but somehow lighter, Ren turned to look at the assembled soldiers, surprised to find genuine solemnity on every face she could see. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough. "All of you. I did not expect any of this. Your father raised a daughter strong enough to carry him through a mountain in the dead of winter," one of the older soldiers said quietly, stepping forward. "That is a man worth honoring, regardless of what blood runs through his veins." Ren felt fresh tears threatening again, though these carried something warmer than the grief that had consumed her moments before. She looked toward Cale, who watched her with an expression she could not quite name, something between tenderness and quiet awe, as though watching her navigate this moment had revealed something to him he had not fully understood before. "I did not expect to find kindness among wolves," she admitted softly, once the soldiers had begun to disperse, giving them a measure of privacy near the fresh grave. "Neither did I expect to find such strength in a hunter's daughter," Cale replied. "It seems we have both learned something today." They remained at the burial ground as afternoon settled over the valley, Ren spending time arranging small stones around the grave, in patterns her family had always used to mark their dead. a tradition passed down from her grandmother that she found herself grateful to remember clearly despite everything. Kale watched from a respectful distance, occasionally offering quiet observations about the valley, about the history of the mountains surrounding them, giving her the space to grieve, while never fully leaving her alone with it. As the sun began its slow descent toward evening, Ren finally rose from beside the grave, brushing frozen dirt from her knees, feeling for the first time in days as though a great weight had finally lifted from her shoulders. It did not erase the grief entirely. She understood now that grief was not something that simply disappeared once its immediate task was completed, but it had shifted into something more bearable, something she could carry forward without it crushing her beneath its weight. "What happens now?" she asked, turning to face Kale fully. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "That depends on what you want," he said. "You are no longer bound by the task that brought you into that mountain pass. You are free to choose whatever path you wish." Ren thought of her small home, likely still standing empty in the valley beyond, of the life she had lived there with her father before everything fell apart. She thought of the Ashford order, still out there somewhere, still hunting her, still convinced she posed some threat simply for existing as her father's daughter. And she thought of the strange, impossible bond that had somehow formed between herself and a king she had known for barely 2 days, a bond that defied everything she had ever been taught to believe. "I do not know," she admitted honestly. "I have spent so long focused only on reaching this moment that I never allowed myself to think beyond it." "That is understandable," Kale said. "Grief does not leave much room for planning the future." "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious what answer he might give. Kale's expression grew thoughtful, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful weight, as though he had considered this question long before she asked it aloud. "I would ask you to return with us," he said, "not as a prisoner, and not as an obligation born from whatever bond exists between us, simply as someone under my protection, until the threat from the Ashford order has been properly addressed. Your home is no longer safe, Ren. You know this as well as I do." Ren considered his words carefully, weighing the practical wisdom of them against every instinct that told her to remain independent, to refuse help, to prove to herself and to the world that she needed no one to survive. But she thought of Cassian's cold eyes at the edge of the tree line, of his promise that the order would return, and she understood that pride alone would not keep her alive against an enemy determined to finish what they had started. "And after the threat is addressed?" she asked. "What then?" "Then you will be free to choose your own path," Kale said. "I will not force you into anything you do not want, bond or no bond, but I would be lying if I said I did not hope you might choose to stay regardless." Something in his honesty disarmed her more than any grand declaration could have. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of manipulation or hidden agenda, and found only quiet sincerity staring back at her. "I will come with you," she said finally, "for now. Until I understand better what this bond means, and until the order is no longer a threat hanging over my head." Relief flickered across Kale's features, quickly masked, but not quickly enough to hide from her entirely. "Thank you," he said. "I know this is not an easy choice, given everything your family has been taught to believe about my kind." "Everything is complicated now," Ren said. "I am beginning to think it always will be, from this point forward." "Perhaps," Kale agreed. "But complicated does not have to mean impossible." As evening settled fully over the burial ground, casting long shadows across the fresh grave and the weathered markers surrounding it, Ren took one final look at her father's resting place, feeling a quiet promise settle into her chest. She would honor his memory not by clinging to old hatreds, but by remaining open to whatever strange path lay ahead of her now, even if that path led somewhere she never could have imagined only a week before. Later that evening, as the army settled into a temporary camp near the edge of the valley, Ren found herself sitting near the central fire, wrapped in the same borrowed cloak she had worn since the storm, watching the soldiers move through their evening routines, with a familiarity that no longer felt as foreign as it had 2 days before. She noticed General Voss standing at the far edge of the camp, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her with an expression that held none of the warmth she had begun to see in the other soldiers. She rose and approached him before she could talk herself out of it, some part of her unwilling to let unspoken tension fester any longer than necessary. "You do not trust me," she said plainly. stopping a respectful distance away. Voss's eyes narrowed slightly, though he did not deny it. "I do not trust easily," he said, "especially not hunters, who appear in our path and unravel the discipline of an entire army within moments of arriving." "I did not ask for any of this," Ren said. "I did not ask to be found by your king, and I certainly did not ask for whatever bond you all seem to believe exists between us. And yet here you stand," Voss said, "at the center of decisions that affect the safety of everyone in this army. Decisions that delay a war we cannot afford to lose. I understand your concern," Ren said carefully, "but punishing me for something neither of us chose will not solve the problem you fear." Voss studied her for a long moment, something almost grudging shifting behind his stern expression. "Perhaps not," he admitted finally, "but understand this, girl. I have served this kingdom for longer than you have been alive. I have watched what happens when kings allow their hearts to guide decisions meant for their heads. I will not watch it happen again without voicing my objection, regardless of whether you find it fair." "Again?" Ren asked, catching the word before he could retreat from it. "What happened before?" Voss's expression closed off entirely, any trace of openness vanishing beneath years of practiced discipline. "That is not a story for tonight," he said, turning away before she could press further. "Rest while you can, Hunter. The road ahead grows harder before it grows easier." He walked away without another word, leaving Ren standing alone near the edge of the firelight, turning his cryptic warning over in her mind with growing unease. She thought of Cale's earlier reluctance to discuss whatever history existed between himself and his general, of the tension she had witnessed the previous morning, and she felt a cold certainty settle into her chest, that whatever secrets remained buried between these two men, they would not stay buried for much longer. She returned to the fire and found Cale waiting for her, his expression questioning as he took in whatever troubled look must have remained on her face. "Voss does not trust me," she said simply, sitting down beside him. "Voss does not trust easily," Cale replied, echoing the general's own words without seeming to realize it. "Give him time, he will come around, or he will learn to keep his objections to himself." "He mentioned something happening before," Ren said carefully, watching Cale's reaction closely. "He said he would not watch history repeat itself. What did he mean?" Something flickered across Cale's face, quickly masked, though not quickly enough to escape her notice entirely. "That is a conversation for another time," he said, his voice carefully even. "Tonight, you should rest. Tomorrow we begin the journey back toward the kingdom, and it will demand every ounce of strength you have remaining." Ren wanted to press further, some instinct warning her that whatever secret Cale and his general shared mattered more than either of them were willing to admit. But exhaustion pulled heavily at her limbs, and she found herself too tired to fight for answers that clearly would not come easily tonight. "All right," she said, settling back against the log beside the fire, "but I will ask again." "I expect nothing less," Cale said, something like a smile ghosting across his features, despite the tension still lingering in his eyes. The army began preparations to break camp as darkness approached, soldiers moving with practiced efficiency around her, and Ren found herself watching Cale direct the preparations with quiet authority, feeling something warm and unfamiliar settling steadily into the space where fear had lived for so long. She did not yet know what awaited her at his kingdom, or what dangers still lingered from the enemies, who had already proven willing to follow her across mountains and through storms. But for the first time since her father's death, she found herself facing the future, without the crushing weight of complete isolation, and that alone felt like the beginning of something worth holding on to. General Voss waited until the camp had gone fully silent, before slipping away from the firelight, moving through the trees with the practiced silence of a man who had spent decades avoiding detection by enemies far more dangerous than his own soldiers. He did not stop until he reached a small clearing well beyond the edge of camp, where a lone figure waited beneath the shadow of a broad pine tree, cloaked against the cold and against recognition both. "You are late," the figure said, stepping forward just enough to reveal Cassian's sharp features beneath the hood. "I came as soon as I could without drawing suspicion," Voss said, his voice low and clipped. "The king watches everything closely now, especially anything concerning her." Cassian's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Then the bond is real." "It is real," Voss confirmed, bitterness threading through his words. "I have seen it before, General. I know what it looks like when it takes hold. Cale will not listen to reason where this girl is concerned. He has already delayed the Eastern campaign twice on her account, and I fear he intends to delay it further still. That is precisely why we approached you, Cassian said. The Ashford Order has no quarrel with you, General Voss. Our quarrel lies with a girl whose father threatened the balance our organizations have maintained for generations, and with a king who now shields her from justice she has not yet faced. I want no part in murder, Voss said sharply, though something in his tone suggested the objection was more procedural than heartfelt. I serve my king. Whatever disagreements I hold with his judgment, I will not betray him outright. No one is asking you to betray him, Cassian said smoothly. We are asking only for information, troop movements, the timing of your return to the capital, small things, easily overlooked, that would allow us to address the girl without involving the king directly at all. If she simply disappears along the road, through no fault of your soldiers, the king's grief would be genuine, and no blame would ever fall upon you. Voss's jaw tightened, old resentment flickering behind his eyes, though whether it aimed at Ren, at Kale, or at some older wound entirely, Cassian could not tell. The last time a king of this kingdom allowed a bond to dictate his decisions, Voss said quietly, it nearly destroyed everything we had built. I will not stand by and watch it happen twice. Then help us, Cassian pressed. Prevent history from repeating itself before it cost this kingdom everything, exactly as you fear. Voss was silent for a long moment, staring out into the darkness beyond the clearing, his expression torn between loyalty and something colder, something that had been growing inside him for years, long before Ren Ashcombe ever stumbled into that mountain pass. I will consider it, he said finally, nothing more. And if I decide to help you, it will be done my way, on my terms, with no harm coming to the king himself. He is stubborn and foolish where this matter is concerned, but he remains my king, and I will not see him hurt in the process. Understood entirely, Cassian said, inclining his head with a deference that did not quite reach his eyes. We ask only that the girl be removed from the equation, nothing more. Voss said nothing further, turning and disappearing back into the trees, toward camp, leaving Cassian alone in the clearing, with a satisfied expression that suggested he had gotten exactly what he came for, regardless of Voss's careful hedging. Back at camp, Ren stirred restlessly beneath her cloak, unable to fully settle into sleep despite her exhaustion. Something about the conversation with Voss earlier that evening had left an uneasy weight in her chest, a feeling she could not quite name, but could not shake either. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the soldiers sleeping nearby, and found her gaze drawn toward Kale, who sat awake near the dying fire, his attention fixed on the darkness beyond the camp's edge, with an intensity that suggested he too felt something unsettled in the air. You should be asleep, he said quietly, without turning to look at her, though she suspected he had known she was awake long before she moved. I could say the same to you, she replied, settling beside him near the fire. Old habits, Kale said. I have never slept easily during campaigns. Too many years spent watching for danger in the dark. Ren studied his profile in the flickering firelight, noting the tension still lingering in his shoulders, despite the outward calm he presented. Something is bothering you, she observed. It has been bothering you since you spoke with Voss yesterday morning. Kale's expression flickered, surprise quickly masked beneath careful neutrality. You are perceptive, he said, more perceptive than I anticipated. I have spent my entire life reading people carefully, Ren said. It is a skill hunters cannot survive without. Will you tell me what troubles you, or must I continue guessing? Kale was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling softly between them, before he finally let out a slow breath and began to speak. Many years ago, he said, before I became king, my father held the throne. He too found his mate unexpectedly, much the way I found you. Her name was Corinne. She was human, though not a hunter, simply a woman, from a village near our borders, who caught his attention entirely by accident. Ren listened carefully, sensing the weight behind every word he chose. My father loved her completely, Kale continued, but many among our court believed the bond made him weak, believed it distracted him from the responsibilities of leadership. Voss was young then, newly appointed as a captain within the royal guard, and he watched as court politics turned increasingly hostile toward my father's choice. When enemies of our kingdom learned of Corinne's existence, they used her as leverage, kidnapping her, in an attempt to force concessions from my father during a critical moment in an ongoing war. What happened? Ren asked softly, though dread had already begun pooling in her stomach. My father chose to negotiate rather than fight, believing it would secure her safe return, Cale said, his voice growing rougher. He was wrong. The enemies who took her had no intention of honoring any bargain. She died before rescue ever reached her, and the war that followed cost our kingdom more lives than anyone could have predicted, all because my father's judgment had been clouded by grief and desperation in equal measure. Ren felt the full weight of the story settle over her, understanding suddenly and completely why Voss had reacted with such sharp suspicion the moment his king's army had stopped for a hunter's daughter in a mountain pass. Voss believes I will become the same kind of weakness, she said quietly. Voss watched my father destroyed by love, and then watched our kingdom nearly destroyed alongside him, Cale said. His fear is not unfounded, even if I believe he is wrong to apply it so completely to our situation. Are you certain he is wrong? Ren asked, the question slipping free before she could stop it. Cale turned to look at her fully then, his eyes steady despite the vulnerability she could see flickering beneath the surface. I am certain, he said, that I refuse to make the same mistakes my father made. I will not allow grief or desperation to cloud decisions that affect the safety of my kingdom, no matter what I feel toward you. But I am also certain that hiding from this bond, denying it exists, would be its own kind of foolishness. My father's mistake was not loving Corinne. His mistake was allowing that love to become a weapon his enemies could wield against him. Ren considered his words carefully, understanding now the depth of what he carried, the careful balance he attempted to maintain between duty and whatever this strange bond between them demanded of him. Then we simply need to ensure that does not happen here, she said finally, that this bond does not become a weapon anyone can use. That is precisely what I intend, Cale said, something resolute settling into his voice, though I fear it will not be simple, given everything the Ashford Order has already shown itself willing to do. They sat together in silence for a while longer, the weight of the story settling comfortably between them rather than driving them apart, and Ren found herself grateful for his honesty, for his willingness to share something so painful, without her having to pry it free through relentless questioning. She understood better now the careful control he maintained over every decision, the discipline that governed even his growing feelings toward her. It did not erase the danger Voss's fear represented, nor the uncertainty of what the Ashford Order might attempt next, but it gave her something solid to hold on to, amid all the uncertainty pressing in from every direction. Elsewhere in the camp, unseen by either of them, Voss lay awake long into the night, staring up at the star-scattered sky, wrestling with a decision that would determine far more than even he yet understood. He thought of his old king, broken by grief after Corinne's death, of the war that had cost so many lives, of the years he had spent rebuilding trust in a kingdom shattered by a single moment of misplaced priorities. He thought, too, of Cale, young and stubborn, and so certain that this time would be different, so certain that history would not repeat the tragedy that had already scarred their people once before. He did not want to betray his king. Every instinct he carried rebelled against the very thought of it. But fear, when it grew old enough and deep enough, had a way of convincing even loyal men that betrayal might sometimes be the only path toward protection. By the time dawn broke over the mountain camp, Voss had made no final decision, though the seed Cassian had planted in that dark clearing had already begun to take root, quiet and patient, waiting for the right moment to grow into something far more dangerous than either Cale or Ren yet suspected. The army broke camp shortly after sunrise, beginning the long journey back toward the capital, and Ren found herself walking beside Cale once more, the previous night's conversation, settling into something between them that felt closer to genuine trust than anything she had allowed herself to feel toward another person since her father's death. She did not yet know about the clearing, or the conversation that had taken place there in the dark, or the careful manipulation Cassian had already set into motion. She only knew that the road ahead stretched long and uncertain before them, and that somewhere within the ranks of soldiers marching steadily around her, danger had already begun taking root in a place she never would have thought to look. The morning air carried a sharpness that promised more snow before the day's end, and as the procession wound its way down from the burial grounds toward the wider valley beyond, Ren found her thoughts drifting toward the kingdom awaiting her, a place she had never seen, and could barely imagine, filled with people who might never accept a hunter's daughter walking freely among them, bond or no bond. She glanced sideways at Cale, at the quiet strength in his posture as he led his soldiers homeward, and wondered how much more complicated their path together would become, before either of them found solid ground to stand upon. By mid-morning, the trail widened into a broad valley road that Wren had never traveled before, flanked by tall pines dusted white with fresh snow. The scale of the landscape stole her breath more than once, mountains rising sharply on either side, like ancient guardians standing watch over the path below. She had lived her entire life within a much smaller radius of forest and village, and the sheer size of the world beyond her old home left her feeling simultaneously small and strangely free. "How much farther to the capital?" she asked, falling into step beside Cale as the army wound its way along the valley floor. 3 more days, if the weather holds," he answered. "Perhaps 4, if another storm moves through before we arrive." "What is it like?" Wren asked, curiosity overtaking the wariness she still carried. "Your kingdom, I mean. I have only ever heard stories, and most of them painted your people as monsters rather than as anything resembling a functioning society." Cale's mouth curved into something almost amused. "What did the stories say?" "That your capital was built from the bones of hunters who dared to oppose you," Wren admitted, a little sheepishly. "That the streets ran with blood on the night of every full moon." "A bit dramatic," Cale said, "though I suppose fear tends toward exaggeration. In truth, my capital is not so different from any village you have known, only larger, and built to accommodate both our wolf forms and our human ones. There are markets and schoolhouses and gardens that bloom even through much of the winter, thanks to warm springs beneath the eastern quarter. My people work and raise families and worry about the same small things that worry anyone anywhere. We are not so different from the world you know, Wren. We have simply been painted as something else for so long that the truth rarely reaches beyond our borders." Wren turned the words over carefully, trying to reconcile them against a lifetime of stories designed to instill fear rather than understanding. She thought of the soldiers around her now, of their quiet kindness at the burial ground, of the young soldier who had offered her his own cloak without hesitation, and found it easier than she expected to believe Cale's description over the tales she had grown up with. "I would like to see it," she said finally, "your capital, despite everything I was taught to believe." "You will," Cale said, something warm settling into his voice. "And I hope, when you do, it surprises you in every way your old stories failed to prepare you for." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the rhythm of marching soldiers and creaking sled wheels filling the space between them pleasantly rather than awkwardly. Wren found herself studying the soldiers around her more closely as the day wore on, noting small details she had missed before in her exhaustion and grief. A young woman near the rear of the column hummed quietly to herself as she walked, a tune Wren did not recognize but found strangely soothing. 2 soldiers near the front argued good-naturedly about which of them had won a wrestling match the previous summer, their laughter carrying easily across the cold air. It was, she realized with some surprise, an ordinary army, full of ordinary people, bound together by loyalty to a king, who clearly commanded genuine respect rather than mere obedience born of fear. Near midday, the column paused for a brief rest near a frozen stream, soldiers breaking into smaller groups to share rations and check equipment before continuing onward. Wren noticed one of the supply carts had been left slightly apart from the others, and a young quartermaster crouched beside it, frowning down at something with visible confusion. "Is something wrong?" Wren asked, curiosity drawing her closer despite herself. "Perhaps nothing," the quartermaster said, though his frown deepened as he examined the contents of the cart. "Several bundles of dried rations appear to be missing since this morning's count. It is likely nothing more than a miscount during last night's setup, but I do not care for discrepancies I cannot explain." Wren felt a small prickle of unease at the report, though she told herself it was likely exactly what the quartermaster suggested, an honest mistake amid the chaos of managing supplies for hundreds of soldiers across difficult terrain. Still, she found herself glancing toward the tree line more than once as the column resumed its march, an instinct honed by years of hunting warning her that something felt subtly wrong, even if she could not name exactly what. She mentioned it to Cale later that afternoon, more out of habit than genuine concern, and watched his expression sharpen slightly at the report before he masked it beneath careful neutrality. Probably nothing, he agreed, echoing the quartermaster's assessment, though something in his tone suggested he intended to look into the matter regardless. But I will have my scouts pay closer attention to our perimeter tonight, simply as a precaution. Ren nodded, satisfied by his answer, unaware of how close his instincts had already drawn him towards suspecting the very betrayal beginning to unfold within his own ranks. She spent the remainder of the afternoon walking in companionable silence beside him, watching the mountains slowly give way to gentler, rolling hills as they moved further from the burial ground and closer toward whatever future awaited her within a kingdom she had never imagined she would one day call home. As evening approached and the soldiers began preparing another camp for the night, Ren caught sight of Voss standing apart from the others once more, his expression distant and troubled in a way that no longer felt like simple distrust of her presence. She thought of Kale's story from the previous night, of Corinne and the tragedy that had shaped Voss's fierce protectiveness over his king, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, what exactly weighed so heavily on the general's mind as the fires were lit against the gathering dark. She did not have long to wonder before the first sign of trouble arrived, though it would take several more days before she understood just how deep the betrayal brewing around her had already grown. Ren woke before dawn to the sound of her own instincts screaming at her, a feeling honed by years of hunting that told her something in the camp had shifted overnight. She sat up slowly, scanning the dim light filtering through the trees, and noticed immediately that fewer soldiers stood guard along the perimeter than had been posted the night before. She rose quietly, careful not to wake anyone nearby, and made her way toward the edge of camp where she had last seen firewood being gathered. She needed kindling for the morning fire regardless, and the simple task gave her an excuse to move, to work off the restless unease coiling in her chest. She had barely stepped beyond the tree line when a hand clamped hard over her mouth, and rough arms hauled her backward against a solid chest. Panic exploded through her, instinct taking over before conscious thought could catch up. She drove her elbow back hard into her attacker's ribs, felt the satisfying give of impact, and twisted free just enough to reach for the blade at her hip. The man staggered but recovered quickly, and she recognized him in the pale morning light as one of the scouting party from days before, one of Cassian's hunters. "Quiet," he hissed, lunging for her again, "or I will make certain you never speak again." Ren did not hesitate. Years of training took over completely, her body moving through familiar motions, even as fear hammered through her veins. She ducked beneath his reaching arm and drove her blade upward, forcing him back rather than aiming to kill, buying herself the space to scream a warning that tore through the quiet morning air. The camp erupted into chaos almost instantly. Soldiers burst from their tents, weapons drawn, as shapes emerged from the tree line on all sides, more hunters than Ren had expected, at least 20 by her quick count, moving with the coordinated precision of a force that had been planning this strike for days. She realized with a cold jolt of understanding that the missing supplies from the previous day had not been a simple miscount at all. Someone had been feeding information to the Ashford order, someone within the camp itself. "Ren." Kale's voice cut through the chaos, and she turned to see him emerging from his tent already partially shifted, his eyes blazing amber in the dim light, movement blurring around him, as instinct and training merged into something devastatingly fast. She had never seen him shift before. Had never seen any wolf shift, not truly, not up close. The transformation was not the grotesque, monstrous thing the old stories described. It was something closer to raw, controlled power, his form shifting fluidly between human and something larger, more primal, without losing the intelligence and purpose behind his eyes even for a moment. He reached her side in seconds, placing himself between her and the nearest attacker, with a growl that vibrated through the very air around them. "Stay close to me," he ordered, and Ren, despite every independent instinct she carried, did exactly that. The battle that followed unfolded in chaotic bursts of motion, soldiers and hunters clashing across the camp, while Ren fought at Kale's side, her training as a hunter proving unexpectedly valuable, even against her own kind. She moved instinctively, striking not to kill but to disable, years of her father's careful teaching, guiding every motion, even in the heat of genuine danger. A hunter lunged toward her from the left, blade flashing in the firelight, and Ren spun to meet him, deflecting the strike, and driving her elbow hard into his throat, before he could recover. Beside her, Kale tore through two more attackers with brutal efficiency, his movements a blur of controlled violence that spoke of years of battle experience, rather than mindless savagery. "Behind you," Ren shouted, catching sight of a third hunter circling toward Kale's unprotected flank, and he pivoted just in time to avoid a strike that would have caught him badly off guard. They fought together with a strange, seamless coordination that neither of them had time to question in the moment, each instinctively covering the other's vulnerabilities, as though they had trained together for years rather than days. Ren felt something shift within her chest as they fought, an awareness of Kale's movements that went beyond simple observation, as though some part of her could sense his intentions moments before he acted on them. The tide of battle began turning steadily in favor of Kale's soldiers, as more of them rallied, the element of surprise the hunters had relied upon evaporating quickly against a force so much larger and better organized. Ren caught sight of Cassian near the edge of the clearing, directing his remaining fighters with increasing desperation, as their numbers dwindled, and something cold and furious settled into her chest at the sight of him. "This ends now," she said, breaking away from Kale's side despite his sharp protest, moving toward Cassian with single-minded focus. Cassian saw her coming and raised his blade, though something flickered across his expression that looked almost like regret. "You should not have survived that pass," he said, his voice tight with something between anger and genuine sorrow. "None of this needed to happen, Ren. Your father's stubbornness set all of this in motion, and now you insist on following the same doomed path." "My father's only stubbornness was refusing to become a murderer," Ren snapped, circling him carefully, watching for any opening. "You are the ones who chose violence over reason." "The Order does not survive on reason," Cassian said. "It survives on strength, something your father forgot, and something you seem determined to forget as well." He lunged suddenly, and Ren met the strike with practiced ease, their blades ringing together in the cold morning air. She fought him with everything her father had taught her, years of careful training finally proving their worth, in a battle she had never wanted but could no longer avoid. Cassian was skilled, faster than most of his companions, but grief and fury lent Ren a ferocity she had not known she possessed, and slowly, steadily, she began to gain ground against him. A shout from nearby drew her attention for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Cassian to press his advantage, his blade slicing across her forearm before she could fully block the strike. Pain flared bright and sharp, but she bit back the cry that threatened to escape, forcing herself to focus, to breathe through the injury the way her father had always taught her. Kale appeared at her side almost instantly, drawn by some instinct she did not fully understand, his eyes blazing with fury at the sight of her blood. He moved between her and Cassian with a speed that left the hunter stumbling backward, genuine fear finally cracking through his carefully maintained composure. "Leave," Kale said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that carried unmistakable authority across the clearing. "Take whatever remains of your fighters and leave this place. The next time you approach her, I will not offer you the mercy of a warning." Cassian's eyes flicked between Kale and Ren, calculation warring visibly with the growing realization that his forces had already lost this fight decisively. Around the clearing, the remaining hunters had begun retreating, several already fleeing into the trees as Kale's soldiers pressed their advantage. "This is not finished," Cassian said, though the words carried far less conviction than they had in their previous encounter. "The Order does not forget betrayal, and it does not forgive it either." "Then come again," Kale said, "and find out exactly how little I fear your Order's threats." Cassian retreated after that, calling out orders to whatever fighters remained, and within minutes, the last of the attackers had vanished back into the tree line, leaving the camp in chaotic aftermath, soldiers tending to wounds and securing the perimeter against any further assault. Ren's arm throbbed painfully where Cassian's blade had caught her, blood soaking through the sleeve of her cloak, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the fight began draining away rapidly, leaving exhaustion and pain in its wake. Kale turned to her immediately, his expression tight with concern as he took in the wound on her arm. "You are hurt," he said, already reaching for a strip of cloth to bind the injury. "It is not deep," Ren said, though her voice wavered slightly with the pain. "I have suffered worse." "That does not mean it should go untreated," Kale said, his hands steady and careful as he worked to stop the bleeding, his touch far gentler than she expected from someone who had just torn through a dozen attackers with brutal efficiency only moments before. As he tended to her wound, Ren found herself studying his face closely, noting the way concern had softened every hard edge of his expression, the way his hands trembled slightly despite his obvious effort to remain steady for her sake. Something warm and fierce settled into her chest, entirely separate from the pain in her arm, a recognition of just how much this strange, impossible bond had already come to mean to her in the span of only a few short days. "Thank you," she said quietly, once he had finished binding the wound. "For coming when you did." "I will always come," Cale said, echoing the promise he had made during their crossing over the gorge days before, and this time, Ren allowed herself to fully believe it. Around them, the camp slowly settled back into order, soldiers assessing damage and treating minor injuries among their own ranks, though thankfully, none had suffered wounds as severe as the ones the hunters themselves had sustained during their retreat. Ren noticed Voss standing near the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the aftermath of the attack, and something in his posture, some subtle tension she could not quite name, sent a fresh wave of unease crawling up her spine. She did not yet know that the general's guilt over information leaked, however reluctantly, weighed on him more heavily than any physical wound could have. She only knew, watching him from across the clearing, that whatever secrets remained buried within this army, they had not yet fully come to light. Later that morning, once the wounded had been properly tended and the camp had regained some semblance of order, Cale called his officers together to assess how the hunters had known precisely where to strike. Ren sat nearby, her injured arm resting carefully in her lap, listening as reports came in from soldiers who had stood watch through the night. The eastern perimeter was thinner than it should have been, one officer reported grimly. 2 of the night watch claim they were reassigned to the supply carts at the last moment, though neither can say clearly who gave that order. Cale's expression darkened considerably at this news, his eyes sweeping across the assembled officers, with an intensity that made several of them shift uncomfortably. "Someone altered the watch rotation without my knowledge," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "I want to know who." Ren watched the exchange with growing unease, her earlier instinct about Voss returning to her with renewed force. She glanced toward the general, who stood near the back of the gathered officers, his face carefully composed, but his eyes fixed on some distant point, rather than meeting his king's gaze directly. She said nothing, unwilling to accuse a man she had no solid proof against, but the seed of suspicion had firmly rooted itself in her mind regardless. "Find out who altered those orders," Cale instructed his officers, quietly and thoroughly. "I will not have hidden weaknesses within my own ranks while an enemy remains active in these mountains." The officers dispersed to carry out his command, and Cale turned his attention back to Ren, some of the hard authority in his expression softening as he knelt beside her to check the binding on her wound once more. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Sore," Ren admitted, "but manageable. I have endured worse injuries during ordinary hunts." "That does not make me worry any less," Cale said, and something in the quiet honesty of the admission sent warmth spreading through her chest despite the ache in her arm. They sat together near the fire as the camp continued its recovery around them, and for a while, neither spoke, content simply to exist in each other's company after the chaos of the morning. Ren found her thoughts drifting toward the strange, seamless way they had fought together during the attack, the awareness she had felt of his movements, even without looking directly at him. "During the fight," she said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "I could sense where you were. Not simply see you, but sense you, almost as though some part of me already knew your next move before you made it. Does that happen with everyone in your army, or was that something else?" Cale's expression grew thoughtful, and when he answered, his voice carried a quiet wonder that told her he had noticed the same thing. "That is not something soldiers typically share, even after years of fighting alongside one another," he said. "That is something closer to what the old stories describe about mate bonds, a connection that runs deeper than mere familiarity." Ren absorbed this information carefully, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest, alongside everything else she had learned over the past several days. She had spent her entire life believing bonds like this belonged only in stories meant to frighten children, and now she found herself living inside one, uncertain and unprepared, but no longer entirely afraid of what it might mean. I do not know how to feel about any of this, she admitted honestly. Only days ago, I believed your kind to be enemies. Now I find myself fighting beside you, as though we had trained together for years, sensing your movements as though we shared a single mind. It is a great deal to accept all at once. You do not need to accept it all at once, Kale said gently. There is no timeline demanding you understand everything immediately. We can simply continue forward, one day at a time, and let understanding come as it will. Ren found comfort in the simplicity of his words, in the patience he continued to offer her despite everything already asked of him in return. She leaned back against the log they sat upon, watching the soldiers around them continue their preparations to resume the journey, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to set aside the lingering unease about Voss and the unanswered questions still hanging over the camp. The sun rose fully over the mountains as the camp finished securing itself against further attack, casting golden light across a battlefield that had, only hours before, been nothing more than a quiet resting place. Ren leaned against Kale's shoulder as exhaustion finally overtook her, grateful beyond words for his steady presence beside her, even as the lingering threat of the Ashford order settled heavily over everything that lay ahead. 3 days passed without further attack, though the memory of the ambush lingered over the traveling camp like a shadow no one could quite shake. Ren's arm healed steadily under the care of the army's healer, an older woman named Maeve, who worked with brisk efficiency and a surprising gentleness that reminded Ren, in small ways, of her own mother, gone now for many years. The investigation into the altered watch rotation had turned up nothing conclusive, much to Kale's evident frustration, though Ren noticed he had begun watching his officers, Voss included, with a new and careful scrutiny. On the 4th evening, as the army made camp within sight of distant lights marking the edge of Kale's kingdom, Ren found herself unable to settle despite her exhaustion. She left her tent quietly and made her way toward the small fire where Kale sat alone, staring into the flames, with an expression heavier than she had seen from him since their journey began. "You are troubled," she said, settling beside him, without waiting for an invitation. "I am always troubled, the closer we draw to home," Kale admitted, a rare note of vulnerability slipping into his voice. "There is much waiting for me there, that has nothing to do with war." "Tell me," Ren said softly. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Ren waited, sensing that whatever he intended to share required careful unfolding rather than rushed explanation. Finally he spoke, his voice low and measured. "When my father died," he said, "the throne passed to me sooner than anyone expected, myself included. I was young, younger than I should have been to carry the weight of an entire kingdom, especially one still healing from the war. Corinne's death set into motion. My council doubted me. Many still do, quietly, though few would dare say it to my face. You have led them well," Ren said. "I have seen it myself, in how your soldiers speak of you, in how they follow your commands without hesitation." "Perhaps," Kale said. "But leading soldiers through a mountain pass is different from leading a kingdom through the complicated politics of peace, alliance, and succession. My council has spent years pressing me to marry, to secure the throne, with an heir born of a match, chosen for strategic advantage, rather than any bond of the heart. I have refused every proposal they have brought before me, believing that if the mate bond existed at all, I would rather wait for it than settle for something lesser." Ren's breath caught slightly at the implication buried within his words, though she said nothing, allowing him to continue at his own pace. "Now that bond has finally arrived," Kale continued, "and it has arrived in the form of a hunter's daughter, someone many within my court will view as an even greater complication than a marriage of pure convenience would have been. I do not say this to frighten you, or to suggest I regret any part of what has happened between us. I say it because I want you to understand fully what awaits you within those walls, before you decide whether you truly wish to walk through them." Ren considered his words carefully, turning them over in her mind against everything she had already witnessed and endured over the past several days. She thought of the burial ground, of the soldiers who had dug alongside her without complaint, of the quiet, unwavering way Kale had protected her against Cassian's attacks, of the seamless understanding that had passed between them during battle, as though they had always belonged together. She thought too of her father, of his belief that peace required people willing to stand in difficult places, and refuse to retreat, simply because the path grew harder. I did not survive an ambush and bury my father, only to run from difficulty now, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty still coiled beneath her ribs. If your court does not wish to accept me, that is a burden I am willing to carry, provided you are willing to stand beside me while I carry it. Something shifted in Cale's expression, relief, and something warmer, something closer to hope, breaking through the careful composure he had maintained throughout their conversation. I will stand beside you, he said, for as long as you will allow it. The words settled between them, with a weight that felt almost like a promise exchanged, though neither of them named it as such just yet. Ren found herself leaning slightly closer to him, drawn by an instinct she no longer fought against, and Cale's hand found hers in the firelight, his fingers lacing carefully through her own. There is something else, Cale said after a moment, his voice growing more serious once more. Something I have not yet told you, because I feared how you might react. Ren's stomach tightened slightly. What is it? The mate bond, once fully accepted by both parties, changes things beyond simple recognition, Cale explained carefully. It binds two lives together, in ways that go beyond ordinary marriage. Among my kind, it means shared strength, shared vulnerability, and in some cases, shared lifespan. If I am gravely wounded, you would feel an echo of that pain, regardless of distance between us. If I were to die before completing the full bond, the grief alone could threaten your own life, particularly once the connection has deepened further than it has now. Ren absorbed this information slowly, understanding finally the true weight of what he had been carefully guiding her toward accepting over the past several days. You are telling me this could kill me, she said quietly, if something happens to you. I am telling you the truth of what this bond demands, Cale said. I do not say this to frighten you away, but because you deserve to understand fully what you are choosing, if you choose to continue down this path with me. Ren was quiet for a long while, staring into the fire, weighing the risk against everything else she had already come to feel over these strange, impossible days. She thought of her father again, of the courage it had taken him to stand against the Ashford order despite the danger it invited, and she found, somewhere within herself, a similar courage rising to meet this new and unexpected challenge. I am not afraid of the risk, she said finally, turning to meet his eyes fully. I have already lost enough in my life to understand that safety is never guaranteed. Bond or no bond, I would rather choose something worth the danger than spend my life protecting myself from feeling anything at all. Cale's expression softened into something Ren had not yet seen from him, unguarded and full of quiet wonder, as though her words had touched something deep within him that he had not allowed himself to hope for in a very long time. You continue to surprise me, he said softly. Good, Ren said, a small smile tugging at her lips, despite the gravity of their conversation. I would hate to become predictable so early, in whatever this is between us. Cale laughed then, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension that had gathered around them throughout the evening, and for a while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low as the distant lights of his kingdom glimmered faintly on the horizon. Tell me about your mother, Cale said eventually, his voice gentle. You have spoken often of your father, but rarely of her. Ren's chest ached faintly at the question, though it was a softer ache now, worn smooth by years, rather than sharp with fresh grief. She died when I was young, she said. Fever, the healer said, though we never learned exactly what caused it. I remember very little about her directly, only fragments. The sound of her voice when she sang while working. The smell of the bread she used to bake every autumn. My father kept her memory alive for me in small ways, telling stories about her whenever I asked, though I think it pained him greatly to do so. He sounds like a man who loved deeply, Cale said. He did, Ren agreed. Perhaps that is why the order's cruelty struck him so deeply. He understood, better than most, what it meant to lose someone precious to senseless violence, and he refused to become an instrument of that same violence toward others, even when it cost him everything. They continued talking long into the night, sharing stories that had nothing to do with war or danger, or the uncertain future awaiting them within the capital, simply learning each other in the quiet, unhurried way that people do when they have finally allowed themselves to trust the person sitting beside them. Ren learned that Cale had once been terrified of deep water as a child, a fear his sister Ellen had teased him about mercilessly, until he finally overcame it, during a summer spent swimming in the lake near their childhood home. Kale learned that Wren had once broken her arm falling from a tree while trying to retrieve a bird's nest for her mother, an injury she had hidden from her father for 2 full days, out of fear he would forbid her from climbing trees ever again. By the time exhaustion finally pulled them both toward sleep, something had shifted fundamentally between them, a foundation of trust and understanding, laid carefully over the span of a single long conversation that felt, somehow, as significant as everything that had happened since that first moment in the mountain pass. The following morning, as the army prepared to complete the final leg of their journey toward the capital, Wren found herself watching the distant silhouette of towers and walls rising against the pale winter sky, with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Whatever awaited her within those walls, she understood now that she would not face it alone, and that understanding alone gave her the courage to continue forward despite every uncertainty still hanging heavy in the air around her. Kale rode beside her for the final stretch of the journey, close enough that their hands brushed occasionally as they walked, and neither of them pulled away from the contact. Behind them, the soldiers who had marched alongside her through storm and ambush alike carried themselves with a quiet pride that suggested they, too, had come to see her as something more than a stranger who had simply wandered into their path. The capital gates opened before them, with a slow, groaning creak that seemed to announce their arrival to the entire city beyond. Wren's breath caught as they passed through, the sheer scale of the place unfolding before her in ways no story had prepared her for. Streets paved with smooth gray stone, wound between buildings of timber and pale brick, their rooftops dusted with fresh snow, smoke curling lazily from dozens of chimneys into the crisp morning air. Market stalls lined the wider avenues, vendors calling out over baskets of winter vegetables and bundled furs, their voices blending into a warm, ordinary hum that felt nothing at all like the blood-soaked streets her childhood stories had described. People stopped to watch as the procession passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open awe at the sight of their king returning home, though Wren noticed more than a few gazes lingering on her with open confusion, whispers passing quickly from one onlooker to the next. She kept her chin lifted despite the scrutiny, refusing to let her nerves show, though she felt Kale's hand find hers once more. A silent reassurance carried through the simple warmth of his fingers wrapped around her own. "They will wonder about you," Kale said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him over the noise of the crowded street. Word travels quickly in a city this size. By nightfall, everyone within these walls will know that their king has returned with a hunter at his side. "Does that trouble you?" Wren asked. "It troubles me only in the sense that I wish I could shield you from whatever gossip follows," Kale admitted. "But I have never been a king who ruled through secrecy, and I do not intend to start hiding things now, least of all something as significant as you." Wren felt a flush of warmth at his words, though the anxious flutter in her chest did not fully ease. She had faced hunters with blades drawn and survived an ambush in the dead of night, yet the prospect of facing an entire city's judgment left her feeling more exposed than either of those dangers ever had. The procession continued through the winding streets until they reached a wide plaza at the city's heart, where a great stone palace rose against the pale sky, its towers capped with dark slate that gleamed faintly beneath the winter sun. Wren had never seen anything so large in her life, and she found herself staring up at it with an expression she suspected betrayed far more wonder than she intended to show. A small group of advisors and court officials had already gathered at the palace steps to greet the returning king, their formal robes a stark contrast to the practical furs and leathers of the traveling soldiers. Wren recognized immediately the careful, assessing way their eyes moved over her, cataloging everything from her worn traveling clothes to the silver blade still resting at her hip, and she felt the weight of their judgment settle heavily across her shoulders even before a single word had been exchanged. An older woman stepped forward from among the advisors, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant braid, her expression composed but sharp with unmistakable scrutiny. "Welcome home, my king," she said, her voice carrying the practiced formality of someone accustomed to court ceremony. "We received word of trouble along the eastern pass. I trust the delay has not compromised our position at the border." "The delay was necessary." "Advisor Calloway," Kale said, his tone even but firm, brooking no argument. "I will explain the full circumstances to the council this evening." Advisor Calloway's gaze flicked toward Wren, lingering there with an intensity that made Ren's spine straighten instinctively. Old instincts from years of facing down suspicious strangers rising automatically to the surface. "And this is the circumstance in question, I presume," Calloway said, her voice carefully neutral, though Ren did not miss the subtle edge beneath it. "This is Ren Ashcombe," Cale said, and something in the way he said her name, steady and unashamed, sent a small thrill of gratitude through her chest, despite the tension of the moment. "She is under my protection, and she will be treated with the respect that status demands." A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the gathered officials, though none dared voice open objection in the king's presence. Advisor Calloway inclined her head slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "Of course, my king," she said. "The council will wish to discuss the matter further this evening, I am sure." "I expected nothing less," Cale replied. As the formal greetings concluded, and the officials began dispersing to attend to their various duties, Ren felt the full weight of exhaustion finally catching up with her, the adrenaline of arrival giving way to a bone-deep tiredness that made even standing upright feel like an effort. Cale seemed to sense the shift immediately, turning to guide her gently toward the palace entrance, rather than lingering further among the watchful crowd. "Come," he said. "You have earned rest, more than anyone else who walked this road with us. The council can wait until evening for their questions." Ren allowed herself to be led inside, grateful beyond words for the reprieve, though she could not shake the lingering unease left behind by Advisor Calloway's careful scrutiny, nor the quiet murmurs that had followed her through the plaza like a current she could not quite outrun. She understood, walking through those grand stone halls for the first time, that surviving the mountains and the Ashford Order's ambush had only been the first challenge she would face. The court awaiting her within these walls promised to be a battlefield of an entirely different kind, one where blades mattered far less than words, and where every whispered rumor carried the power to wound just as deeply as any weapon Cassian's hunters had wielded against her. Only Voss remained apart from the growing warmth surrounding the procession, his expression carefully guarded as the capital drew steadily closer, the weight of an unresolved decision still pressing heavily upon him despite the days that had passed since his conversation with Cassian in that dark clearing. He had not yet decided what he would do with the information the Ashford Order still awaited from him, torn between old loyalty and older fear, and as the gates of the capital finally rose into view before them, that unresolved tension settled like a stone in the pit of his stomach, heavy with the knowledge that whatever choice he made next would carry consequences none of them could yet fully imagine. The council chamber fell silent the moment Cale entered, though the tension in the room had clearly been building long before his arrival. Ren stood near the doorway, uncertain whether her presence had been requested or simply tolerated, watching as a dozen advisors and generals took their seats around a long stone table, carved with symbols she did not recognize. "My king," Advisor Calloway began, rising from her seat with the same careful formality she had shown that morning. "Word of your return has already spread through the entire capital, along with word of the girl you brought with you. The council has concerns that cannot wait for a more convenient hour." "Then voice them," Cale said, taking his seat at the head of the table without hesitation. Calloway's gaze flicked briefly toward Ren, before returning to Cale. "You delayed the Eastern campaign by nearly a week to escort a hunter through the mountains," she said. "Our scouts report movement along the border that suggests our enemies grow bolder with each day we remain distracted. Meanwhile, rumors already circulate that our king has found his mate in the daughter of a family sworn to destroy our kind. Do you understand the danger such rumors pose to the stability of this kingdom?" "I understand it perfectly," Cale said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel beneath the surface. "I also understand that the bond is not a rumor, Advisor. It is real, confirmed by every soldier who marched with me through that pass." A murmur swept through the assembled council, and Ren felt the weight of dozens of eyes shifting toward her once more, calculating and wary in equal measure. A broad-shouldered man near the far end of the table leaned forward, his expression openly hostile. "With respect, my king," he said, "the mate bond, if it is genuine, does not erase generations of bloodshed between hunters and wolves. Her family's guild has killed dozens of our kind over the years. How can this council trust that she does not intend to use this bond against us, whether by her own design or through manipulation by others?" "Ren has done nothing to earn such suspicion, General Brine," Cale said sharply. She fought beside my soldiers, against an ambush, orchestrated by the very guild you fear. She buried her father, rather than abandon him in the snow, and she has shown more honor in the span of a single week than some who have sat at this table for years. Ren felt a flush of gratitude at his defense, though the hostile stares around the table did not soften in response. She stepped forward finally, unwilling to remain silent while her fate was debated, as though she were not present at all. "I understand your concerns," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous tremor beneath her ribs. "I did not ask for this bond, and I understand it complicates matters for your kingdom, in ways I am still learning to grasp myself. But I did not come here to cause harm, nor to manipulate anyone toward some hidden purpose. My father died because he believed peace between our peoples was possible. I would like the chance to prove he was right, if this council will allow it." Silence fell across the chamber, broken only by the soft crackle of torches lining the stone walls. General Brine studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally leaning back in his seat without further comment. Advisor Calloway's gaze lingered on Ren, with something that might have been grudging respect, though her expression remained carefully guarded. "Words are easily spoken," Calloway said finally. "Time alone will reveal whether they carry truth behind them." "Then let time make that judgment," Cale said, "rather than fear and rumor. I have made my decision regarding Ren's place within this kingdom. I ask only that this council extend the same patience toward her that they would extend toward any stranger earning their trust." The meeting continued for some time after that, discussion shifting toward the ambush in the mountains, toward the ongoing threat posed by the Ashford Order, toward strategies for securing the eastern border before the delayed campaign could resume. Ren remained near the back of the chamber, listening carefully, absorbing details about the kingdom's politics that she suspected would prove valuable in the days ahead, though the hostile undercurrent from several council members never fully faded from the room. When the meeting finally concluded, Ren found herself walking alongside Cale through the quiet palace corridors, exhaustion and lingering tension weighing heavily on both of them. "That went better than I feared," Cale said, though his tone lacked full conviction. "It went as well as could be expected," Ren said carefully. "I do not think Advisor Calloway or General Brine will trust me easily, no matter how much time passes." "They do not need to trust you easily," Cale said, "only eventually." Ren said nothing further, though a heavy weight had settled into her chest during the meeting that she could not fully shake. She thought of the hostile stares, of the calculated suspicion in Calloway's eyes, of General Brine's open hostility, and understood with growing clarity just how precarious her position within these walls truly remained. She was not simply asking Cale's court to accept a stranger. She was asking them to accept a fundamental unraveling of hatred that had defined relations between their peoples for generations, and no amount of good intention on her part would make that unraveling painless for anyone involved. That night, unable to sleep despite the comfortable chambers Cale had arranged for her within the palace, Ren found herself standing at a window overlooking the moonlit city, turning over everything she had witnessed since arriving. She thought of the whispered rumors already spreading through the streets, of the political tensions simmering just beneath the surface of every polite exchange within the palace walls, and a slow, creeping doubt began settling into her chest that she could not fully banish, no matter how hard she tried. She thought of Cale, of the way he had defended her without hesitation, before his entire council, risking his own standing and authority for her sake. She thought of the war still simmering along the eastern border, delayed already because of decisions made on her behalf, and of how much further that delay might grow if the council's suspicion continued to fester unresolved. She was not a soldier. She was not a politician. She was a hunter's daughter who had wandered into a mountain pass at exactly the wrong moment, and now an entire kingdom's stability seemed to hinge, at least in part, on decisions surrounding her presence within it. The doubt grew heavier as the night wore on, until finally, sometime before dawn, Ren made a decision that felt both terrifying and strangely clear. She could not, in good conscience, remain within these walls if her presence threatened to unravel everything Cale had worked to build. She loved him, she realized with a jolt of surprise at how easily the word rose unbidden to her mind. But love did not erase the practical danger her continued presence represented to his kingdom's stability. She gathered what few belongings she carried, moving quietly through the sleeping palace, her heart heavy with the weight of a decision she knew would hurt him deeply, though she told herself it was the only path that made sense, given everything the council had voiced that evening. She made her way toward the stables, intending to slip away before dawn broke fully over the city, to disappear back into the mountains and find some way to survive on her own once more, far from the political complications her presence had already caused. She had barely reached the stable doors when a familiar voice stopped her cold. Going somewhere? Ren turned to find Kale standing in the shadows near the stable entrance, his expression a mixture of hurt and quiet understanding that struck her far harder than anger would have. She had not expected him to find her before she could leave. She had not prepared any explanation that felt adequate to the weight of what she was about to say. "I cannot stay," she said finally, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain steady. "Your council fears exactly what I feared they would, and I will not be the reason your kingdom fractures from within, delaying wars and dividing loyalties simply because of a bond neither of us chose. You deserve better than a hunter's daughter dragging chaos through your court." Kale crossed the distance between them slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You believe leaving will solve this," he said quietly. "But you are wrong, Ren. If you leave, you will not save my kingdom from division. You will only ensure that whatever unites my people against this fear never has the chance to take root at all. And you will leave me carrying a grief I do not think either of us survives easily, bond or no bond. I cannot watch you lose everything you have built because of me," Ren said, tears finally spilling free despite her effort to hold them back. "Then stay," Kale said simply, reaching out to gently wipe the tears from her cheek, his touch achingly tender, despite the desperation clearly threading through his voice. "Stay, and let us face this together, exactly as we have faced everything else since that first moment in the pass. I did not survive the Ashford Order's ambush or convince my council to extend you patience, only to lose you now to your own fear of causing me harm." Ren stood frozen for a long moment, torn between the fear that had driven her toward the stables and the undeniable pull of everything Kale represented, everything they had built together across these strange, difficult days. Finally, she let out a shaking breath, the fight draining out of her as she leaned into his touch, allowing herself, for the first time since arriving within these walls, to fully believe that perhaps she did not have to face this alone after all. "I am afraid," she admitted quietly. "Not of your council, or even of the Ashford Order. I am afraid of losing you, or of becoming the reason you lose everything you have worked to protect." "Then let us be afraid together," Kale said, "rather than apart. I promise you, Ren, whatever comes next, I would rather face it beside you than safely alone." In the days that followed, Ren settled slowly into the rhythms of palace life, though the adjustment did not come easily. She spent mornings in the training yards, sparring with soldiers who had marched beside her through the mountains, their earlier wariness having long since softened into genuine camaraderie. Afternoons she spent with Maeve, the army healer, learning about the herbs and remedies used within the kingdom, finding unexpected comfort in the quiet, practical work of tending to others. It was during one such afternoon that she first noticed the change in Voss. She had gone searching for Maeve near the healer's quarters when she passed the general standing alone in a narrow courtyard, staring down at a folded letter in his hands with an expression of such raw anguish that Ren nearly turned away rather than intrude upon what was clearly a private moment. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders had curled inward, as though bracing against some invisible blow, made her pause instead. "General Voss," she said carefully, "are you well?" He startled at her voice, quickly folding the letter and tucking it away, though not before Ren caught a glimpse of unfamiliar handwriting scrawled across the page. "Fine," he said, too quickly, his usual gruffness sounding forced rather than natural. "I did not realize anyone was nearby." "You seem troubled," Ren said gently, unwilling to let the moment pass entirely, despite the tension that still lingered between them. "If something weighs on you, I am willing to listen, whatever your feelings toward me might be." Something flickered behind Voss's eyes, old grief and something sharper, something closer to guilt, though he masked it quickly beneath his familiar stern composure. "Your concern is unnecessary," he said. "I have carried heavier burdens than this before, and I will carry this one as well." "As you wish," Ren said, though she did not fully believe him. "But the offer remains open, General, regardless of whatever distrust still lingers between us. Voss studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he gave a curt nod and walked away without further explanation. Ren watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling once more into her chest, the same instinct that had warned her during the ambush, now whispering that something remained deeply wrong beneath the general's carefully controlled exterior. She mentioned the encounter to Cale that evening, though he seemed to dismiss it as simple stress from the ongoing tension with the council and the delayed campaign. Ren wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Voss's burden was nothing more sinister than old grief resurfacing under the strain of recent events, but some quiet, persistent instinct refused to let the matter rest entirely, even as the days continued to pass and no further evidence of danger presented itself. She did not know, as she went about her days learning the rhythms of a kingdom slowly beginning to feel less foreign than it once had, that Voss's private anguish stemmed from a second letter he had received from Cassian only that morning, one carrying a threat far more direct than anything the hunter had offered during their first clandestine meeting in the forest clearing. She did not know that the general's carefully guarded loyalty had finally begun to crack beneath pressure he could no longer bear alone, nor that the choice he had spent weeks avoiding now loomed closer than ever before, demanding resolution whether he felt ready to provide it or not. Whatever quiet peace Ren had found in the weeks since that dawn in the stable yard, she could not fully shake the feeling that the true test of everything she and Cale had built together still lay ahead of them, closer now than either of them yet understood. The soldiers came for Ren in the middle of the night, their boots echoing sharply against the stone floor of the palace corridor outside her chambers. She woke instantly, old instincts flaring bright with alarm, even before the door burst open, torchlight spilling harsh and sudden across her room. "Ren Ashcombe," the lead soldier said, his voice cold and formal, though Ren recognized genuine reluctance flickering behind his eyes. "You are under arrest, by order of General Voss, on charges of treason against the crown." "Treason?" Ren said, disbelief crashing over her as she scrambled from her bed, reaching instinctively for the blade she kept nearby, though a second soldier moved quickly to block her path, his own weapon raised in warning. "This is absurd. I have done nothing against this kingdom. I only carry out my orders," the lead soldier said, his expression tight with discomfort. "Please, do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Ren's mind raced, panic and confusion tangling together as the soldiers moved to bind her wrists, careful but firm, clearly under strict instruction to avoid unnecessary harm, despite the severity of the charge. She thought immediately of Cale, of finding some way to reach him, to make sense of whatever had happened while she slept peacefully, unaware that her entire world was about to be upended once more. "Where is the king?" she demanded, as the soldiers began leading her from her chambers into the torchlit corridor beyond. "He would never sanction this. Something is wrong." "The king is currently unaware of this action," the lead soldier admitted quietly, glancing around as though fearful of being overheard. "General Voss has assumed emergency authority, citing evidence of a plot against the crown that he claims implicates you directly." Ren's stomach dropped as understanding began crystallizing through her panic. Voss, the letters he had hidden, the guilt she had glimpsed in his expression during their encounter in the courtyard. Whatever secret burden he had carried these past weeks had finally come to a head, and somehow, impossibly, it had resulted in her arrest for a crime she had not committed. She was led through the palace's lower halls toward a chamber she had never seen before. Cold stone walls, lined with iron bars, clearly meant to hold prisoners of significant importance, given the heavy guard posted at its entrance. The soldiers deposited her inside one of the cells with careful, almost apologetic efficiency, before retreating, leaving her alone in the dim torchlight, with nothing but her racing thoughts for company. She did not have long to wait before General Voss himself appeared, flanked by several soldiers loyal directly to him, rather than to the crown at large. His expression, when he finally faced her through the iron bars, carried none of its usual stern composure. Instead, she saw something haunted and desperate, a man clearly at war with himself, even as he moved forward with whatever plan he had set into motion. "You seem surprised," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. "I am more than surprised," Ren said sharply. "I am furious. What treason do you claim I have committed, General? I have done nothing but try to survive since the moment I stumbled into your army's path." You have destabilized this kingdom, simply by existing within it, Voss said, though his voice lacked full conviction, as though even he struggled to believe the justification he offered. The council grows divided, the Eastern campaign remains delayed, and the Ashford Order continues threatening violence against this kingdom, violence that will only cease once you are no longer a factor within these walls. You are working with the Order, Ren realized aloud, horror and understanding crashing together in equal measure. That is what this has always been about. Cassian did not simply retreat after the ambush failed. He turned to you instead. Something flickered across Voss's face, guilt and anguish briefly overwhelming his careful composure, before he forced it back beneath rigid control. They threatened everything I have spent decades protecting, he said quietly. My family. This kingdom's stability. I did not choose this path easily, Ren, but I have watched what happens when a king allows love to override wisdom, and I will not stand by and watch that mistake destroy us all a second time. So instead you destroy an innocent woman and betray the very king you claim to protect, Ren said, fury sharpening every word. That is not wisdom, General. That is cowardice, dressed in the language of duty. Voss flinched at her words, though he did not retreat from his position. The council will vote on your fate by morning, he said instead, his voice hardening once more into something colder, more resolved. Evidence has already been prepared implicating you in a plot to weaken this kingdom from within. Evidence that will be difficult to refute regardless of its truth. Unless the king renounces this bond entirely, publicly and completely, you will be executed for treason before the sun sets tomorrow. Ren felt the blood drain from her face, the full weight of his words settling over her like a physical blow. You cannot do this, she whispered. Kale will never believe such lies, and even if the council does, he would never allow this to happen. He will not have a choice, Voss said. The evidence has already reached every member of the council. By the time he learns what has happened, the process will already be too far underway to reverse, without risking outright civil war between his supporters and mine. I have given him a way to save you, Ren. Renounce the bond, and you will be exiled rather than executed. It is more mercy than the Order intended to offer you. And if he refuses? Voss's expression grew grim. Then this kingdom will tear itself apart over a war neither faction can afford to fight, and everything I have tried to prevent will happen regardless, only worse, and bloodier, than anything Corinne's death ever caused. He turned and left without waiting for her response, leaving Ren alone, in the cold stone cell, her mind reeling with the impossible weight of what he had just revealed. She thought of Kale, of the promise he had made to always stand beside her, and wondered, with a fear sharper than anything the Ashford Order's blades had ever caused her, whether even his strength would prove enough to overcome a betrayal orchestrated from within his own trusted circle. News of the arrest reached Kale within the hour, torn from sleep by a frantic servant who had witnessed the soldiers leading Ren away. He moved through the palace with barely restrained fury, his wolf form threatening to break free entirely, as fear and rage tangled together beneath his ribs. He found Voss waiting for him in the throne room, flanked by soldiers loyal to his authority, and the sight of his most trusted general standing in open defiance struck him harder than any physical wound could have. Explain yourself, Kale said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that echoed through the vast chamber. I am protecting this kingdom, Voss said, though his voice wavered slightly beneath the weight of his king's fury. From threats, you refuse to see clearly, blinded as you are, by a bond that has already cost us more than you realize. You have betrayed me, Kale said, disbelief and fury warring visibly across his features. Betrayed the very kingdom you claim to protect, by conspiring with the Ashford Order against an innocent woman. Voss's composure cracked visibly at the accusation, guilt flooding his expression despite his attempt to maintain authority. I did what I believed necessary, he said. I have watched you delay campaigns, ignore council concerns, risk everything for a bond that nearly destroyed this kingdom once before, under your father's reign. I will not watch history repeat itself simply because I lacked the courage to intervene. You call this intervention? Kale snapped. You call framing an innocent woman for treason, threatening her execution unless I renounce the single bond I have waited my entire life to find, an act of protection? This is not protection, Voss. This is exactly the kind of tragedy you claim to be preventing. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the vast chamber, decades of trust and loyalty hanging fractured between them. Finally, Voss's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from his posture, as the full weight of his betrayal seemed to settle over him at last. "The council votes at dawn," he said quietly. "Renounce the bond, my king, and she lives, exiled but alive. Refuse, and the evidence I have gathered will condemn her, regardless of what either of us wishes." "Then I will expose that evidence as the fabrication it surely is," Cale said, "and I will expose your betrayal alongside it, regardless of the cost to our history together." "You would risk civil war," Voss said, "over a bond only days old." "I would risk everything," Cale said, his voice quiet now, but carrying a conviction that left no room for doubt, "before I allow fear to convince me that love itself is the enemy." "That is the lesson my father's death should have taught this kingdom, Voss, not the lesson you seem determined to enforce instead." Voss said nothing further, though something in his expression suggested Cale's words had struck deeper than he wished to admit. He turned and left the throne room without another word, leaving Cale alone, with the crushing weight of what lay ahead. A battle not against foreign enemies or ambushing hunters, but against betrayal, woven into the very heart of his own court. Cale made his way to the lower chambers immediately after, demanding entry to Ren's cell despite the guards' hesitant objections, their loyalty clearly torn between their king and the general who had ordered her imprisonment. He found her sitting against the cold stone wall, exhaustion and fear etched clearly across her features, though she straightened immediately at the sight of him, relief flooding her expression despite the dire circumstances surrounding them both. "Cale," she breathed, rising to meet him at the bars separating them. "I am here," he said, reaching through the iron bars to grasp her hands firmly in his own. "I will not let this happen, Ren. I promise you, whatever it takes, I will not let Voss's fear, or the council's suspicion, cost you your life." "He said you could save me by renouncing the bond," Ren said quietly. "Exile instead of execution." "I will not renounce you," Cale said fiercely. "Not now, not ever, regardless of what cost that refusal demands of me." Ren felt tears threatening despite her effort to remain strong, overwhelmed by the fierce conviction in his voice, by the unwavering loyalty he continued to offer her, even in the face of such devastating betrayal. "I do not want you to lose everything because of me," she whispered. "You are not the one costing me anything," Cale said gently. "Voss's fear and betrayal are the true cost here, not you. I will find a way to prove your innocence, and to expose the truth behind this conspiracy, whatever it takes." They remained together at the bars for as long as the guards would allow, drawing strength from each other's presence, even as dawn crept steadily closer, bringing with it a council vote that would determine far more than simply Ren's fate. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Ren knew, Cassian and the Ashford Order waited eagerly for news of her execution, confident that Voss's betrayal would finally accomplish what their ambush in the mountains had failed to achieve. But as morning light began filtering weakly through the small barred window high above her cell, Ren found herself holding on to a fragile, stubborn hope, born from Cale's unwavering conviction, and from the memory of everything they had already overcome together, since that first fateful meeting in the snow. Whatever the council decided in the hours ahead, she refused to believe that their story would end here, in a cold stone cell, betrayed by fear rather than defeated by honest battle. The council chamber filled quickly, as dawn broke fully over the capital, advisors and generals taking their seats with grim, purposeful expressions that left little doubt about the gravity of the proceedings ahead. Ren was brought before them under heavy guard, her wrists still bound, though she held her chin high, despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. Cale stood near the head of the chamber, his expression a carefully controlled mask that did nothing to hide the fury simmering just beneath the surface. Voss presented his evidence first, a collection of letters and testimonies that painted Ren as a willing conduit for Ashford Order infiltration, claiming she had maintained secret contact with Cassian throughout the journey from the mountain pass. Ren listened in horrified disbelief, as fabricated details wove themselves into something disturbingly plausible, twisted fragments of truth, like her recognition of Cassian at the ambush, reframed as evidence of prior collaboration, rather than the tragic history it actually represented. "This is a lie," Ren said, unable to remain silent any longer, despite the guard's warning hand on her shoulder. I have never once communicated with the Ashford Order, beyond fighting against them. General Voss knows this. He orchestrated this deception himself. A ripple of murmurs swept through the chamber, several council members exchanging uneasy glances at the accusation. Advisor Calloway leaned forward, her sharp eyes moving between Wren and Voss with evident calculation. "That is a serious claim," Calloway said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I have my word," Wren said, "and I have the testimony of any soldier who witnessed General Voss's private meeting with Cassian in the forest, days before we reached this city." Voss's expression flickered, just slightly, before he forced his composure back into place. "A convenient accusation," he said, "offered with no proof beyond her own claims." "There is proof," a new voice interjected, and Wren turned in surprise to see the young soldier who had first offered her his cloak on that first frozen night, stepping forward from where he had been standing quietly among the guards lining the chamber walls. "I saw General Voss leave camp that night. On the same evening the Eastern Watch rotation was mysteriously altered. I did not think anything of it at the time, but I have not been able to stop thinking of it since Wren's arrest." Voss's face paled visibly, the careful mask he had maintained throughout the proceedings finally beginning to crack under the weight of mounting scrutiny. "One soldier's uncertain memory proves nothing," he said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "Perhaps not alone," Cale said, stepping forward now, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority. "But combined with the timing of the ambush, the altered watch rotation, and General Voss's own admission to me last night that he has been in communication with Cassian regarding Wren's fate, I believe this council has more than enough reason to question exactly whose treason we are truly examining here." The chamber erupted into a chaos of raised voices, council members demanding clarification, several openly turning accusatory stares toward Voss, rather than toward Wren, for the first time since the proceedings had begun. Voss stood rigid amid the mounting chaos, his expression a battlefield of guilt, fear, and something close to desperate resolve. "I did what I believed necessary to protect this kingdom," he said finally, his voice cutting through the noise with enough raw emotion that the chamber gradually quieted to hear him. "You do not understand what it cost me to watch my king walk the same path that destroyed his father. I could not stand by silently a second time. And so instead," Cale said, his voice quiet now, though it carried through the chamber with devastating clarity, "you became the very danger you claimed to be preventing. You conspired with the enemies who murdered Wren's father. You endangered every soldier in that camp through your altered orders. And you have now attempted to condemn an innocent woman to death, all in the name of protecting a kingdom that you have instead brought closer to civil war than any bond ever could." Voss said nothing, his shoulders finally sagging beneath the full weight of everything he had set into motion, the fight visibly draining out of him, as the truth of Cale's words settled over the chamber like a judgment already rendered. Advisor Calloway rose slowly from her seat, her expression grave as she addressed the assembled council. "This changes the nature of these proceedings considerably," she said. "I move that the charges against Wren Ashcombe be formally withdrawn, pending full investigation into General Voss's conduct and his connections to the Ashford Order." A chorus of agreement rippled through the chamber, though not without lingering murmurs of unease from a handful of council members who remained visibly uncertain about the larger implications of a bond between their king and a hunter's daughter, even with the immediate crisis of Wren's false accusation resolving in her favor. Wren felt the tension in her chest finally begin to ease, relief flooding through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled beneath the sudden release of fear she had carried through the long, sleepless night. But even as the guards moved to release her bindings, she caught sight of movement near the chamber's outer doors, soldiers bearing insignia she did not recognize, moving with a coordinated urgency that sent fresh alarm crashing through her relief. Cale noticed it as well, his expression sharpening instantly as one of the newly arrived soldiers pushed forward, breathless and pale with alarm. "My king," the soldier said, "forgive the intrusion, but scouts report a large force approaching the capital from the eastern road. Ashford Order banners, alongside what appears to be a portion of General Voss's personal guard, moving in formation toward the city gates." The chamber fell into stunned silence, every eye turning first toward Voss, whose expression had shifted from resignation to genuine horror, and then toward Cale, whose jaw had tightened with the grim understanding that whatever Voss had set into motion had already grown beyond his ability to control it. They were never going to wait for the council's decision, Voss said quietly, horror dawning fully across his features. Cassian intended to attack regardless of the outcome here. I have been played for a fool, as thoroughly as I feared this kingdom would be played by love alone. Kael's expression hardened into something fierce and resolute, the fury and grief of the morning's revelations giving way entirely to the focused clarity of a king facing down an enemy at his own gates. Then we have no more time to waste on words, he said, turning to address the assembled council and soldiers alike. Prepare the defenses. Whatever quarrel exists within these walls will wait until the threat beyond them has been dealt with. Ren, finally freed from her bindings, moved instinctively to Kael's side, old instincts as a hunter, rising swiftly to meet the new danger bearing down upon them. Whatever relief she had felt only moments before, at her exoneration, evaporated entirely beneath the urgent reality that the true battle, the one that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of the entire kingdom, had only just begun. The final confrontation, she understood with growing certainty, had not yet truly begun. The city gates shuddered under the weight of the approaching force, war horns sounding across the capital as soldiers scrambled to their positions along the walls. Ren stood beside Kael atop the gatehouse, watching the combined army of Ashford hunters and Voss's misled soldiers advance across the snow-covered fields beyond, their numbers greater than she had expected, banners snapping sharply in the cold wind. There are too many, she said quietly, old fear threatening to overwhelm the fierce resolve she had carried since stepping out of that council chamber. Even with your full garrison, this will not be an easy fight. No, Kael agreed, it will not. But we are not facing this alone. Below them, General Voss appeared at the base of the gatehouse, his expression carrying none of the careful composure he had maintained throughout the morning's proceedings. Instead, raw determination burned in his eyes as he addressed the soldiers gathering around him, soldiers who had once answered to his authority as readily as they answered to their king. I have wronged this kingdom, Voss called out, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled ranks. I let fear convince me that betrayal could protect what loyalty alone should have defended. I cannot undo what I have already done, but I will not stand aside while the consequences of my failure threaten everyone within these walls. Those who followed me astray, I ask you now to follow me back, toward where our true loyalty belongs. A tense silence followed his words before, slowly, soldiers who had wavered in their allegiance began moving to stand alongside the rest of the garrison. Voss's genuine remorse, apparently proving more persuasive than Cassian's earlier manipulation had been. Kael watched the display from above with a complicated expression, old betrayal warring visibly with the recognition of genuine redemption unfolding before him. Will you trust him again? Ren asked quietly. Not easily, Kael admitted. But today, I will accept whatever aid he offers, regardless of the trust that still needs rebuilding between us. The battle that followed unfolded with brutal, chaotic intensity as the Ashford Order's forces reached the city walls, siege ladders slamming against stone as hunters scrambled upward, under covering fire, from archers positioned along their approach. Ren fought alongside Kael's soldiers with fierce determination, her training as a hunter proving invaluable once more as she moved through the chaos, disabling attackers with practiced efficiency even as the sounds of battle roared around her on every side. Kael fought at the front lines, shifted fully into his wolf form now, a devastating blur of motion that tore through the ranks of attacking hunters, with a ferocity that spoke to years of battle-hardened experience. Ren caught glimpses of him through the chaos, awe and fear, tangling together in her chest, at the sheer power he commanded, tempered always by the same controlled purpose she had witnessed since that very first day in the mountain pass. Cassian appeared near the breach in the outer wall, directing his remaining forces with cold, calculated precision, and Ren felt a surge of furious resolve building within her chest at the sight of him. She fought her way toward him through the chaos, years of grief and anger, finally finding their focus in the man who had orchestrated her father's death, and every tragedy that had followed in its wake. This ends today, she said, finally reaching him amid the churning battle, her blade raised and steady, despite the exhaustion beginning to weigh heavily on her limbs. Cassian turned to face her, something almost resigned, flickering across his features, despite the battle raging violently around them. "You should have died in that mountain pass," he said, though the conviction behind the words had noticeably weakened since their previous encounters. "None of this needed to happen." "You made this happen," Ren said. "Every single step of it. My father's death. This war. Voss's betrayal. All of it traces back to your order's refusal to accept that hunters and wolves might build something better than endless hatred." "Perhaps," Cassian admitted, something like genuine weariness entering his voice for the first time since she had known him. "But belief does not change what has already been set into motion." They fought fiercely amid the chaos of the larger battle, blades clashing in brutal, desperate exchanges, as soldiers and hunters continued their struggle around them. Ren fought with everything her father had taught her, every lesson in patience and precision, finally converging into a battle that mattered more than any hunt she had ever undertaken. Cassian was skilled, but exhaustion and doubt had begun eroding his composure, and slowly, steadily, Ren gained the advantage, driving him backward toward the breach in the wall. A final exchange left Cassian disarmed, his blade skittering across the frozen stone, and Ren stood over him, her own weapon raised, years of grief and fury demanding release in that single decisive moment. Cassian stared up at her, resignation finally fully overtaking whatever conviction had driven him this far. "Finish it," he said quietly. "I have no illusions about what awaits me either way." Ren hesitated, her father's voice echoing suddenly and clearly in her memory, his old warning about the difference between justice and cruelty, settling firmly into her racing thoughts. She lowered her blade slowly, though she did not release him from her steady gaze. "My father believed killing without necessity made you no better than the thing you claimed to fight against," she said. "I will not become that, not even for you. You will face judgment, Cassian, but it will not be delivered by my blade in anger." Soldiers arrived quickly to secure him, and Ren turned back toward the larger battle, finding it had already begun tilting decisively in Kale's favor, as Voss's returning soldiers bolstered the garrison's numbers significantly. Without their leader's coordination, the remaining Ashford Order fighters began retreating in scattered disarray, the assault crumbling as quickly as it had begun. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western horizon, the battle had ended, the city gates secured once more, and the surviving attackers either captured or driven back into the surrounding wilderness. Ren found Kale near the gatehouse, shifted back into his human form, exhaustion and relief mingling across his features, as their eyes finally met across the battle-worn courtyard. She crossed the distance between them without hesitation, and he pulled her into his arms the moment she reached him, both of them trembling slightly with the release of tension that had built steadily since the moment the soldiers had come for her in the middle of the night. "It is over," he murmured against her hair. "For now," Ren said, though relief flooded through her words despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on every part of her body. In the days that followed, the kingdom slowly began the work of healing from the chaos the Ashford Order's final assault had caused. Voss submitted himself fully to the council's judgment, accepting responsibility for his betrayal even as his last-minute redemption weighed in his favor during the proceedings that followed. Kale, ever mindful of the lesson his father's tragedy had taught him about the dangers of unchecked vengeance, argued for mercy, tempered with genuine accountability, and the council ultimately stripped Voss of his rank, while allowing him to remain within the kingdom, tasked with years of service toward rebuilding the very trust he had shattered. The Ashford Order, weakened significantly by Cassian's capture and the loss of so many fighters during the failed assault, retreated from active conflict for the first time in generations, opening a fragile but genuine opportunity for the peace Ren's father had always believed possible between hunters and wolves. Kale moved quickly to establish formal channels of communication with remaining hunter communities willing to consider a different path forward, and Ren found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, becoming an integral part of those delicate negotiations, her unique position as both hunter and mate to the Alpha King, granting her a perspective no one else within the kingdom could offer. Advisor Calloway, once so carefully suspicious, became one of Ren's staunchest allies in the months that followed, her sharp political instincts proving invaluable in navigating the remaining resistance among certain council members still uncertain about the bond's long-term implications. Even General Brine, gruff and skeptical as ever, grudgingly admitted that Ren's courage during the final battle had earned her a measure of respect he had not expected to extend toward a hunter's daughter. One evening, as winter's grip on the capital began to loosen at last, Ren sat with Kale in the quiet garden behind the palace, watching the first buds of green pushing tentatively through the retreating snow. She had spent the afternoon in a lengthy meeting with a delegation of hunters from a village near her old home, cautious but curious people who had traveled a great distance to see for themselves whether the rumors of peace held any truth. The conversation had been difficult in places, old wounds surfacing whenever the Ashford Order's legacy of violence entered the discussion, but by its end, several among the delegation had agreed to return home, carrying word that perhaps, finally, a different future was possible. "You did well today," Kale said, watching her with quiet pride as she recounted the meeting's details. "It was harder than I expected," Ren admitted. "Some of them still look at me the way your council once did, as though I might be some trick, some trap waiting to spring. I understand their caution. I carried the same suspicion myself, not so long ago." "Trust rebuilds slowly," Kale said, "but it does rebuild, given patience and consistency. You have shown both, more than anyone had any right to ask of you." Ren leaned into him, grateful for the quiet comfort of his presence after a long day of careful diplomacy. She thought of her father often during these months, of how proud he would have been to see hunters and wolves sitting together at the same table, discussing cooperation rather than violence, even if the path forward remained slow and uncertain in places. She thought, too, of Voss, who had thrown himself into his new duties with a grim, determined focus, working tirelessly alongside soldiers he had once betrayed to rebuild the trust his fear had shattered. He rarely spoke to her directly, still burdened by guilt he had not yet fully forgiven himself for, but she had noticed, more than once, his quiet efforts to support the very peace negotiations his earlier actions had nearly destroyed. Cassian remained imprisoned within the capital, awaiting a fuller reckoning for his role in her father's death and the ongoing conflict that had followed, though Ren found she carried less anger toward him now than she once had. Grief had a way of softening its sharpest edges over time, provided a person allowed themselves the space to heal, rather than clinging to old wounds indefinitely. She had chosen healing, slowly and deliberately, and found the choice growing easier with each passing month. The kingdom itself had begun to feel less foreign to her with each week that passed, its streets and markets and quiet gardens settling into something that increasingly resembled home rather than mere refuge. She had made friends among the soldiers who had once marched beside her through the mountains, had grown close to Maeve and to several of the palace's other healers, and had even found, in Advisor Calloway, an unexpected mentor whose sharp political guidance had proven invaluable as Ren navigated her new and complicated role within the court. On a clear morning some months later, as the last traces of winter finally began giving way to the first signs of spring across the capital, Kale led Ren back toward the very mountain pass where their story had first begun, the same narrow stretch of frozen ground where an entire army had once stopped in its tracks at the scent of an impossible bond. Snow still clung to the shadowed corners of the pass, though the harsh, biting wind that had once nearly claimed Ren's life had softened into something gentler, carrying the faint promise of the seasons yet to come. "Why here?" Ren asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "Because this is where everything began," Kale said, taking her hands in his own as they stood together at the center of the pass. "I wanted to stand here with you again, not as a king protecting a stranger, and not as two people fighting for survival against enemies on every side, but simply as ourselves, finally free to choose this path, without fear hanging over every step." Ren felt tears gathering, though these carried none of the grief that had once accompanied her through this very stretch of frozen ground. "I never could have imagined," she said softly, "that dragging my father's coffin through the snow would lead me here, to this moment, with you." "Nor could I have imagined," Kale said, "that an ordinary day's march would become the moment my entire world changed irrevocably. For the better, because of a girl brave enough to stand her ground against an army, rather than surrender to fear." He knelt then, right there in the snow where they had first met, and Ren felt her breath catch as understanding dawned fully across her features. The soldiers who had traveled with them, the same soldiers who had once frozen in their tracks at the scent of an impossible bond, gathered respectfully at a distance, witnessing a moment that felt, to all of them, like the true completion of a story that had begun in fear and ended finally, in hope. Ren Ashcombe, Kale said, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly threading through it. Will you stand beside me, not simply as my mate, chosen by fate and bond alike, but as my equal, my partner, in building whatever future still awaits this kingdom, and the peace we have both fought so hard to protect? Ren did not hesitate, her answer rising freely, and without doubt from someplace deep within her chest, someplace that had been slowly healing since that very first frozen morning when an entire army had paused, impossibly, for a girl dragging a coffin alone through the snow. Yes, she said, and the word carried within it every mile she had walked, every loss she had survived, and every fragile, hard-won hope for the future, now stretching out before them both, bright and uncertain and entirely, finally, worth embracing. The wind stirred softly through the pass as they embraced, carrying with it the quiet promise of spring, finally arriving after a long, difficult winter. And somewhere in the mountains beyond, the last echoes of old hatred began, slowly but surely, giving way to something new,